Section 11 of Colin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Colin by E.F. Benson. Book 2, Chapter 8. Colin was lying on the beach at the men's bathing place at Capri after an hour's swim. A great wave of heat had swept over Europe, and now, though it was late in October, the conditions of summer still prevailed. Might have been June still, and he here with his father, quietly making the plans that had turned out so well. On this beach it was that he lay, pondering his reply to Violet's letter, which told him she was engaged to Raymond. He had thought out his reply here, that congratulatory reply, saying how delightful her news was, and as for feeling hurt, that had been a thorn to Violet, which had pricked and stung her as she had confessed. She had confessed it to him between dusk and dawn on their marriage night. He knew all about it, that casual kiss in the dusk of the yew hedge the night before he and his father left for Italy had begun it. His indifference to her had made her ache, and his arrival back in England had made the ache intolerable. To be mistress at Stanier had become worthless to her, and to reward her sense of its worthlessness had come the news that she would not be that only. Colin stirred his sun-stained body to get a fresh bed of hot sand and pebbles for his back. He had absorbed the heat of those on which he had been lying. The little kneading movement of his elbow brought him on to another baked patch. That was gloriously hot, made him pant with pleasure as he anticipated one more cool rush into the sea. He purred and thought of the lovely days that had passed, of the lovely day that was here, of the lovely days that awaited him. Quite methodically, he began at the beginning. Violet and he had been married in the first week of October, on the very day, indeed, that had been arranged for her marriage with Raymond. There was a suave brutality about that. He had made Raymond, under some slight hint of pressure, advocate it. Raymond, under that same hint, had become marvellously agreeable. He had been almost sentimental and had urged Violet to be married on that day. He himself would be best man if Colin would allow him, instead of being bridegroom. Her happiness, it appeared, was of greater import to him than his own. Little conversations with Colin in the smoking-room, before Colin went up to say good-night to Violet, were responsible for this Scotch sentimentality. Raymond had been quite like a noble character in a sloshy play. He had understood and entered into the situation. He had given up without bitterness. He had rejoiced at his brother's happiness, and had been best man. The pair had left that afternoon for Italy. The attitude which he had forced on Raymond gave Colin the most intense satisfaction. He had been made to appear to be affectionate and loving, high-minded and altruistic, and Colin knew what wormwood that must be to him. It was tiresome enough, as he knew from his experience of the last fortnight, to be supposed to love when you only liked, but how infinitely more galling it must be to suppose to love when you hated. But he did Raymond justice. A mere hint at publicity for that paper which lay at his banker's, together with his mother's letter, and that confirmatory line from Uncle Salvatore, produced wonderful results. Raymond could be bridled now, with a single silken thread. Colin's thought turned over that leaf of the past, and pored over the present, this delightful actual present. There was the sun baking his chest and legs, and the hot sand and pebbles warmed to his back, while the cool, clear sea awaited him when the rapture of heat became no longer bearable. Violet had not come down with him today. She had taken to the rather more sophisticated bathing establishment at the marina, where more complete bathing dresses were worn, and men did not dress and undress in the full eye of day. Colin quite agreed with her that the marina was more suitable for her. This bay was really the men's bathing place, and although women could come here if they chose, they were rather apt to be embarrassing and embarrassed. she would find the huts at the marina more satisfactory, and still more satisfactory to him was to be rid of her for a few hours. There was a stern, pitiless insistency about love which bored him. He could not be quite tranquil when, from moment to moment, he had to make some kind of response. A glance or a smile served the purpose, but when Violet was there he had, unless he betrayed himself, always to be on the lookout. This love was a foreign language to him, and he must attend if he were to reply intelligently. He liked her quite immensely, but that which was a tireless instinct to her was to him a mental effort. It was no effort, on the other hand, to be with Raymond, for there his instinct of hatred functioned flawlessly and automatically. And Colin turned over that page of the present, and cast his eyes over the future. At the first glance, all seemed prosperous there. His father had aged considerably during the last few months, and just before their marriage had had a rather alarming attack of vertigo, when, after a hot game of tennis, he had gone down with Colin to the bathing pool to swim himself cool. The boy had not been the least frightened. He had brought his father to land without difficulty, and on his own responsibility had telephoned for his father's doctor to come down to Stanier. The report had been quite reassuring, but a man who had left his 60th birthday behind him must not overexert himself at tennis and then bathe. Nature, the wise old nurse, protested. This suggested eventualities for the future. No doubt his father would now be more prudent and enjoy a long, ripe old age. Colin quite acquiesced. His father had been so consistently good to him that he scarcely felt any impatience about that. But what this morning occupied him with regard to the future was the idea, not of his father's death, but of Raymond's. In this uncertain world, accidents or illness might carry off even the strongest and sulkiest, and he himself would then be in a very odd position. Supposing, as was natural, his father died first. Raymond, on the strong case that could be built on the evidence of his mother's letter to Salvatore and the erasure in the consulate archives, would no doubt be incontinently hoofed out of his promised land, and Violet be in possession with him as husband to the owner. But if Raymond died first, Colin, by his juggling, would merely have robbed himself of the birthright which would be rightfully his. It had been a great stroke to provide at his father's death for Raymond's penniless illegitimacy, and by himself marrying Violet to submerge his own. Not possibly could he have provided for the eventuality of Raymond's predeceasing his father as well, but now that he had married Violet, it was worth while brooding and meditating over the other. Something might conceivably be done if Raymond died first, but he could not as yet fashion the manner of it. The morning had sped by all too quickly, and by now the other bathers had gone and the beach was empty, and Colin plunged once more into that beloved sea. The cool, brisk welcome of it encompassed him. Its vigour seemed to penetrate his very marrow and brain with its incomparable refreshment, and he began to think of this problem with a magical lucidity. Colin regretfully left the water, and put his clothes into the boat in which he had been rowed round from the marina, meaning to dress on the way there. Young Antonio, the son of Giacomo, Philip's old boatman, had brought him round here, and was now asleep in a strip of shadow at the top of the beach, waiting till Colin was ready to return. There he lay, with his shirt open at the neck, and a carnation perched behind his ear, lithe and relaxed like some splendid young fawn. The boy's mouth smiled as he slept. Was he dreaming, thought Colin, of some amorous adventure proper to his age and beauty? His black hair grew low on his forehead. The black lashes swept his smooth brown cheek. It seemed a pity to awaken, and for a minute or two Colin studied his face. Violet, before now, had remarked on his extraordinary resemblance, except in point of colouring, to Colin, and he wondered if, through his noble VIII blood, they were related. He liked to think he resembled this merry Nino. He would almost have been willing to give him his blueness of eye and golden hair, and take in exchange that glossy black, which caught the tints of the sky among its curls. Then Nino stirred, stretched a lazy arm, and found his hand resting on Colin's shoulder. At that he sprang up. "Ah, pardon, signor," he said. "I slept. You have not been waiting." Colin had picked up Italian with great ease and quickness. It came naturally to his tongue. "I have been watching you smiling as you slept, Nino," he said. "What have you been dreaming about?" Nino laughed. "And if I was not dreaming of the signorino himself?" he cried. "What about me?" demanded Colin. "Oh, just a pack of nonsense," he said. "We were in the boat, and it moved of itself without my rowing, and together we sat in the stern, and I was telling you the stories of the island. You have heard the most of them, I think, by now. Are you not going to dress?" "I'll dress in the boat," said Colin. "But there's that story of Tiberio which you wouldn't tell me when the signora was with us." "Indeed, the story of Tiberio was not fit for the signora. A fat, bald old man was Tiberio, and as ugly as a German. 7 palaces he had on Capri. There was one here, and so shameful were the things done in it that, so the priests say, the sea rose and swallowed it. But I do not think that the priests are right. They say that, do you think, signor, to frighten us from the wickedness of Tiberio? And one day Tiberio saw, scusi, signor." How attractive was the pagan gaiety of these young islanders. They believed in sunshine and wine and amusement, and a very good creed it was. They took all things lightly except the sirocco. Love was a pleasant pastime, an affair of eager eyes and a kiss and a smile at parting, for had he not seen Nino himself on the corner of the piazza yesterday, making signals to his girl, or one of them, and then strolling off in the warm dark? They were quite without any moral sense, but it was ludicrous to call that wicked. Pleasure sanctified all they did. They gave it and took it, and slept it off, and sought it again. How different from the bleak and solemn northerners. "Imagine," mused Colin, as this really unspeakable history of Tiberio gaily unfolded itself, encouraging a gardener's boy to regale you with bawdy tales. How he would snigger over the indecency, thus making it indecent. How heavy and dreary it would all be. But here was Nino, with his dancing eyes and his laughing mouth and his "Scusi, signor," and all was well. These fellows had charm and breeding for their birthright, and somehow minds which vice did not sully. The end of the story was rapidly told, with gestures to help out the meanings of the recondite words, for they were approaching the marina, and Colin's signora was waiting for him there, as Nino had already seen with a backward glance. An amazing moral was tacked on to the conclusion of those dreadful doings of Tiberio, for when Tiberio died, God permitted the devil to torture him from morning to night as the anniversary of that orgy came round. "But that is not likely, Nino," said Colin, deeply interested. "If Tiberio was so wicked, the devil would not want to torture him. He would be the devil's dear friend." Nino took both oars in one hand for a second, and crossed himself. "What do you do that for, Nino?" asked Colin. "It is safer," said Nino. "Who knows where the devil is?" Colin made an admirably apposite remark, a thing that Neapolitans said, so Mr. Cecil had told him, when they found themselves talking about the devil, and Nino was duly appreciative. "That is good," said he. "That muddles them up. Yes, signor, it is as you say. If Tiberio were very wicked, he and the devil would be very good friends. Do you believe in the devil, signor, in England? We are not quite sure. And in Capri, Nino? Not when the sky is blue, like the signor's eyes," said Nino. "But when there is sirocco, we are not so certain." The prow of the boat hissed and was quenched against the sandy beach. There, under the awning of the stabilimento, was Violet, rather fussed at the leisurely progress of Colin's boat, for in 2 minutes more the funicular would start, and if they missed that, there was the dusty drive up to the town. "Quick, darling, quick!" she called out. "We have only a couple of minutes." "Oh, don't fuss," said he. "Run on if you want to. Nino and I are talking folklore." He felt in his pockets and spoke in Italian again. "Nino, I haven't a single penny," he said, "to pay you for your boat. If you are in the town tonight, come to the villa and I will pay you. If not, tomorrow. I shall want your boat again at 10. "Sicuro," said the boy. "Buon appetit." He stepped into the water and held out his bare arm like a rail for Colin to lean on as he jumped on to the beach. "Thanks," he said. "Same to you, Nina. Filistanie, you know?" Violet was waiting at the edge of the beach. The midday steamer had just come in from Naples, and now there was no need to hurry, for the funicular would certainly wait for the passengers who were landing as small boats at the quay. "Nice bathe, darling?" she said as Colin joined her. Colin found himself mildly irritated by her always saying "darling." She could not speak to him without that adjunct, which might surely be taken for granted. "Yes, darling," he said. "Lovely bathe, darling. And you, darling?" There was certainly an obtuseness about Violet which had not been hers in the old days. She seemed to perceive no impression of banter, however good-natured, in this repetition. Instead, that slight flush which Colin now knew so well spread over her face. "Yes, darling. The water was lovely," she said. "Like warm silk." "Ugh," said Colin. "Fancy swimming about in silk. What horrible ideas you have." "Don't be so literal," said she. "Just a silky feeling. Look at these boatloads of people. Aren't they queer? That little round red one, like a tomato, just getting out." Colin followed her glance. There was no doubt whom she meant, for the description was exactly apt. But even as he grinned at the vividness of her vegetable simile, a sense of recognition twanged at his memory. The past, which he had thought over this morning, was sharply recalled, and somehow, the future entered into it. "Why, that's Mr. Cecil," he said, "the consul at Naples. You must know him, Vi." Mr. Cecil greeted Colin with welcome and deference. Consular business had brought him to Capri. He had no idea that Mr. Stanier was here. Was Lord Yardley here also? "No, but someone much more important," laughed Colin. "My wife. We're on our honeymoon. Violet, this is Mr. Cecil, who was so kind to me when I was here last. Mr. Cecil's our consul at Naples." It was natural that Mr. Cecil should have his lunch with them, though he pleaded shortness of time. He was going back by the afternoon boat. "But you clearly must have lunch somewhere," said Colin, "and we'll give you a very bad one probably, but a quick one if you are in a hurry." "Ah, that's delightful of you." Colin was hugely cordial, exerting the utmost of his charm. He even curtailed his siesta in order to walk down with his visitor to the consular office in the town, and gratefully promised, on behalf of Violet and himself, to spend the night at his house on their way back to England. He wanted that. He had made up his mind to get that invitation, for it formed part of the plan which had come to him in his final swim that morning, before he got into Nino's boat and heard that horrible scandal concerning Tiberio. He wanted Violet to pass the night at the consulate. There might arise emergencies which would render that convenient. It was like her to have waited for his return instead of going to her room for the afternoon sleep. And there she was under the pergola where they had lunched at the far end of the garden. She was sitting with her back to the garden door, and did not see him enter. And, quick as a lizard and as silent-footed, Colin tiptoed into the house. If she saw him, she would discuss Mr. Cecil. She would linger in the garden, and as likely as not linger in his room, and he wanted his nap. If she chose to sit out under the pergola, it was no business of his, and there was no proof, after all, that she was waiting for his return. Another day he would take a sandwich down to the bathing place, and like Nino, have his siesta in some strip of shade down there, where no one would disturb him, or wait for him, or want to talk to him. Violet was a dear. It was hardly possible to have too much of her, but just now and then it was nice to have no one watching you and loving you. A couple of hours later he strolled, still coatless, into the great cool sitting-room. She was already there, waiting to make tea for him. "I never heard you come in, darling," she said. "I was waiting for your return in the pergola. and then eventually I came in and peeped into your room, and there you were, fast asleep." "Funny I shouldn't have seen you," said Colin. "I just went down with Mr. Cecil to the piazza and was back in less than half an hour. I adore Mr. Cecil. He enjoys himself so much and drinks such a lot of wine. A gay dog." "Oh, I thought he was a dreadful little man," said Violet. "You're too refined," said Colin. "You don't like little red bounders. By the way, I've solemnly promised him that you and I will spend the night at his house in Naples on our way home." "Darling, how could you?" asked Violet. "To please him. He thinks you're marvellous, by the way. Don't elope with him, Vi. Besides, it's a good thing to be friends with a consul. He reserves carriages and oils the wheels of travel." "Colin, you're full of surprises," said she. "I should have thought Mr. Cecil was the very type of man you would have found most intolerable." Colin laughed. "You don't allow for my VIII blood," he said. "The bounding VIII blood. Shouldn't I love to see you and Uncle Salvatore together? Now what shall we do? Let's go for an enormous walk till dinner time." She came behind him and stroked the short hair at the back of his neck. "Darling, would you mind if I didn't come all the way?" she asked. "I'm rather tired. I had a long swim this morning. I'll start with you and make myself comfortable and wait for you to come back." "Don't come at all, Vi, if you're tired," he said. "I can't have you tired. Then if you sit down and wait for me, I shall feel you're waiting and hurry in consequence. Besides, I shall have to come back the same way." "Then I shall certainly come with you all the way," said she. "It's more laziness with me than tiredness." Colin moved his head out of reach of the caressing fingers as if by accident. "You tickle me," said he. "And if you're obstinate, I shan't go for a walk at all, and I shall get fat like Mr. Cecil. Stop at home and be lazy for once, Vi." Colin, as usual, had it his own way, and managed in his inimitable manner to convey the impression that he was very unselfish in foregoing her companionship. He established her with a book and a long chair, and greatly to his own content, went off alone up the steep hillside of Monte Solaro. 'Twas but a parody of a path that lay through the dense bush of aspen and arbutus that closed the slopes, and he would have had to keep holding the stiff elastic shoots back for Violet to pass, to have tarried and dawdled for her less vigorous ascent had she come with him. But now, having only his own pace to suit, he soon emerged above this belt of woodland that buzzed with flies and a hot, stagnant air, and came to the open uplands that stretched to the summit. The September rains and the thick dews of October had refreshed the drought of the summer, and as if spring were here already, the dried and yellow grasses, tall and seeding, stood grounded in a new velvet of young growth, and tawny autumn lilies reared their powdered stamens laden with pollen. Still upwards he passed, and the air was cooler, and a wind spiced with long travel over the sea blew lightly but steadily from the northwest. Presently he had reached the top. All the island lay at his feet, and the peaks of the nearer mainland were below him too, floating, promontory after promontory, on the molten rim of the sea. Far away to the west, like the shadow of a cloud, he could just descry the coast of Corsica. All the world and the glory of the sea lay at his feet, and how he lusted for it! What worship and fealty was he not ready to give for the possession and enjoyment of it? There was no crime, thought Colin, that he would not commit, if by that the flame of life burned brighter. He would do a child to death, or rob a sacristy of its holy vessels, or emulate the deeds of Tiberius to feed that flame. And he laughed to himself, thinking of the amazing history told by Nina with the black eyes and laughing mouth. Surely Tiberius must have been an alliance and a love match with evil itself, such gusto did he put into his misdeeds. In this connection, the thought of the family legend occurred to him. Dead as the story was, belonging to the mists of medievalism, it could not be a Stanier without some feeling of proprietorship in it. Naturally, it was up to anybody to make a bargain for his soul with the devil, if he believed in the existence of such things as devils or souls. And certainly for generations, when sons of his house came of age, they had either abjured their original benefactor or made alliance with him. Of course, they had really made their choice already, but it it was quaint and picturesque to ratify it like that. For generations now, that pleasant piece of ritual had dropped into misuse. It would be rather jolly, mused Colin, when he came of age next March, to renew it. The edges of his thoughts lost their sharpness, even as the far-off capes and headlands below melted into the blue field of sea and sky, and as he lay in the little sheltered hollow which he had found at the very summit of the peak, they emerged into a blurred panorama of sensation. His life, hitherto, with its schemings and acquirings, became of one plane with the future, and all that he meant the future to bring him. He saw it as a whole, and found it exquisitely good. Soon now he must return to the love that awaited him in the villa. Before many days he must go back to England. A night at the consulate first with Violet, and then just awaiting on events until his father's death or Raymond's. His eyelids dropped. The wind rustled drowsily in his ears. Colin sat up with a start. He had not been conscious of having gone to sleep, but now, wide awake again, certainly seemed as if his brain recorded other impressions than those of this empty eminence. Had there been someone standing by him? Or was it only the black shadow of that solitary pine which his drowsiness had construed into the figure of a man? And had there been talking going on? Or was it only the whisper of the wind and the dried grasses which sounded in his ears? In any case, it was time to go, for the sun had declined westwards, and losing the flames and rays of its heat, was already become but a glowing molten ball close above the sea. How strangely the various states of consciousness melted into each other, though the sense of identity persisted. Whatever happened, that remained. At the corner of the garden, perched on the wall which ran alongside the steep footpath up from the town, was a little paved platform, where they often sat after dinner. There had been a letter for Colin from his father, which had arrived during his walk, and now, holding it close to his eyes to catch the last of the swiftly fading light, he communicated pieces of its contents to Violet. "Raymond's gone back to Cambridge," he said. "Father seems reconciled to his absence." "That's funny now. There's my elder brother an undergraduate and me a married man and not of age yet. It was touch and go whether it wasn't the other way about, Vi." "Oh, don't, Colin," said she. "I can't bear to think of it." "But you did think of it. Wasn't that a nice surprise for you when I told you that to marry me didn't mean giving up Stanier? That made all the difference." She came close to him. "Colin, don't be such a brute," she said. "There is just one thing you mustn't jest about, and that's my love for you. I almost wish I wasn't going to get Stanier in order to show you. Don't jest about it." "I won't, then. Serious matter. But don't you jest about getting Stanier. Vi, if you would move your head an inch, I should get more light." "What else does he say?" she asked. Colin ran his eyes down the page. "Lots of affection," he said. "He wants us back. Uncle Ronald's down at Stanier, and Aunt Hester. And then some more affection. Oh, he's had another little attack of giddiness, nothing to worry about, so we won't worry. And Aunt Hester's going off a bit, apparently getting to repeat herself, Father says. And then some more affection." Colin lit a match for his cigarette, disclosing a merry face that swam before Violet's eyes after the darkness had closed on it again. "That's so like old people," he said. "Aunt Hester wrote to me the other day saying she was quite shocked to see how slowly my father walked. She's quite fond of him, but somehow it gives old people a little secret satisfaction to look for signs of breaking up in each other." "Colin, you've got a cruel eye sometimes," said Violet. "Not in the least. Only a clear one. And then there's Father saying that Aunt Hester is beginning to repeat herself. And in the same dip of the pen he repeats himself for the third time, sending us his love." Violet gave a quick little sigh. "At the risk of repeating myself, you really are cruel," she said. "When you love, you have to say it again and again. You might as well say that if you are hungry, you mustn't ask for something to eat because you ate something yesterday. It's a permanent need of life. I hope you don't think that I'm breaking up because I have told you more than once that I rather like you." Poor Vi, sadly changed. said Colin, teasing her. "I have changed," she said, "but not sadly. We're both changed, you know, Colin. A year ago we no more thought of falling in love with each other than of killing each other, but I don't call the change sad." Colin felt extremely amiable this evening, pleasantly fatigued by his walk and pleasantly exhilarated by his dinner, but he had to stir up his brains to find a suitable reply. There was the unfair part of it. Violet talked on this topic without effort. Indeed, it was an effort for her not to, whereas he had to think. "But you call it serious," he said. "I mustn't laugh about it and I mustn't weep. What am I to do?" "Nothing, darling. I want you just to be." He determined not to let his amiability be ruffled. "I certainly intend to be as long as ever I can," he said. "I love being. It's wonderfully agreeable to be, and I would much sooner be here than at Cambridge with Raymond." "Ah, poor Raymond," said Violet. That exasperated Colin. To pity or to like Raymond appeared to him a sin against hate. "My dear, how can you talk such nonsense?" he said. "It's pure sentimentality, Vi. Born of the dark and the stars. You don't really pity Raymond any more than I do, and I'm sure I don't. I hate him. Always have. And I don't pretend otherwise. Why, just now you were telling me not to mention him, and 2 minutes afterwards you were saying, 'Poor Raymond.'" "You were reminding me of what might have happened," she said. "It was that I couldn't bear to think of. But I can be sorry for Raymond. After all, he took it very well when Uncle Philip told him what we were going to do. I believe he wanted me to be happy in spite of himself." This was too much for Colin. The temptation to stop Violet indulging in any further sympathy with Raymond was irresistible. She should know about Raymond and hate him as he himself did. He had promised Raymond not to tell his father of a certain morning in the old park, but he had never promised not to tell Violet. Why he had not already done so he hardly knew. Perhaps he was keeping it for some specially suitable occasion, such as the present moment. "He wanted you to be happy, did he?" he exclaimed. "Do you really think that? If so, you won't think it much longer. Now, do you remember the morning when there was an escaped lunatic in the park?" "Yes," said she. "Raymond went out shooting pigeons and I played golf. My bicycle punctured, and I walked home through the old park. There I found Raymond crouching behind the wall, meaning to shoot me as I came round that sharp corner of the road. I came up close behind him while he watched for me by the rhododendron, and oh Lord, we had a scene. Absolutely scrumptious. There was I covering him with my revolver, which all the time hadn't got a cartridge in it, and I made him confess what he was up to." "Stop, Colin! It's not true!" cried she. "It is true. He confessed it and wrote it all down, and my father and I witnessed it, and he signed it, and it's at my bank now. Perhaps he thought you would be happier with him than me, and so from unselfish notions he had better fire a barrel of No. 5 full in my face. All for your sake, Violet. My word, what unutterable bunkum!" His hate had submerged him now. That final bitter ejaculation showed it clearly enough, and it pierced Violet like some metallic stab. He had no vestige of consideration for her, no faintest appreciation of the horror of his stinging narrative, which pealed out with some hellish sort of gaiety. She could not speak. She could only crouch and shudder. Colin got up, scintillating with satisfaction. "I promised him not to tell father," he said. "It was an act of great clemency. Perhaps it will be too great some day, and I shall. And I didn't distinctly mean to tell you, but you really forced me to when your heart began bleeding for that swine and saying he wanted to make you happy. Come, Vi, buck up. Raymond didn't get me. It was clever of him, by the way, to see his opportunity with the loony was loose. I rather respected that. Let's go indoors and have our piquet." She got up in silence, just pressed his arm, and went up the gravelled path towards the house. Colin was about to follow, when looking over the garden wall, he saw Nino's figure coming up the path, and remembered that he had told him that if he were in the town he might come up to the villa and receive the liras he was owed for his boat this morning. Instantly the picture of sitting with Nino out here in the dusk, with a bottle of wine between them, presented itself. Gay and garrulous would Nino be, that bright-eyed, laughing faun, more faun-like than ever at night, with Tiberian or more modern tales and wonderful gesticulations. That would be a welcome relaxation after this tragic, irritating talk with Violet, who was much more attuned to Nino's philosophy. Indoors there would be a game of piquet, with those foolish pasteboard counterfeits of kings and queens and knaves and 5 liras as the result of all that dealing in meditation and exchange of cards. That knave Nino would be far more amusing. And even piquet was not the worst of the tedium he would find indoors. There was Violet, clearly very much upset by his tale. She would be full of yearnings and squeezing and emotional spasms. Tomorrow she would be more herself again and would bring a lighter touch to life than she would be disposed to give it tonight. He really could not spend the evening with Violet if it could possibly be avoided. He called in a low voice to Nino. "Signor," said Nino with gay, upturned face. "Wait 10 minutes, Nino," he whispered. "If I don't come out again, you must go. I shall want your boat tomorrow morning. But wait 10 minutes, and then perhaps I shall be able to give you a glass of wine and hear more stories, if you have half an hour to spare." "Si, signor," whispered Nino, pleased at this mystification and intrigue. Colin followed quickly after Violet. She was in the big studio, where a card table was laid, walking up and down, still horrified and agitated. She placed her hands on Colin's shoulders and dropped her head there. It required all his self-control not to jerk himself free. "Oh, Colin," she said, "the horror of it! How can I ever speak to Raymond again? I wish you hadn't told me." There was blame in this, but he waved his resentment at that for the present. "I wish I hadn't indeed, darling," he said. "If it's disturbed you so much, and I'm afraid it has. Go to bed now. You look awfully tired. We won't have our piquet tonight. We shall neither of us attend." "It's all so terrible," she said. "Supposing your bicycle hadn't punctured." He laughed. "I remember I was annoyed when it happened, but it was a blessing after all," he said. "The point that concerns us is that it did, and another point is that you are not to sit up any longer." "But you'd like a game," said she. "What will you do with yourself?" Colin knew his power very well. He turned, drawing one of her hands that rested on his shoulder around his neck. "The first thing I shall do with myself is to take you to your room," he said, "and say good night to you. The second is to sit up for another half hour and think about you. The third is to look in on tiptoe and see that you are asleep. The fourth, which I hope won't happen, is to be very cross with you if you are not. Now I'm not going to argue, darling." The 10 minutes were passing, and without another word he marched her to her room, she leaning on him with that soft, feminine, clinging touch, and closed her Venetian shutters for her, leaving the windows wide. "Now, promise me you'll go to sleep," he said. "Put it all out of your mind. Raymond's at Cambridge. You've got to not think about him. I don't. Good night, Vi." At the door he paused a moment, wondering if she had heard him speak to Nino over the wall. In case she had, it were better to conceal nothing. "I'm just going downstairs to give Nino what I owe him for his boat this morning," he said. "I've told him to come up for it. I shall just peep in on you, Vi, when I go to bed. If you aren't asleep, I shall be vexed. Good night, darling." Colin went downstairs again and opened the garden door into the road. There was Nino sitting on the step outside. He beckoned him in and shut the door behind him. "Come and have a glass of wine, Nino," he said. "Come quietly. The signora has gone to bed." He led the way into the dining room and brought out the bottle of wine. "There, sit down," he said softly. "Cigarettes? Wine? Now, for another of your histories only fit for boys to hear, not women. So Tiberius had supper with a gilded girl to wait on him, and a gilded boy to give him wine? And what then?" The atrocious tale shocked nobody. This bright-eyed Nino was just a faun with the candour of the woodland and the southern night for conscience. In face and limb and speech he was human, but not of the humanity which wrestles with evil and distrusts joy. and just as Colin knew himself to be, except in his northern colouring, another Nino in bodily form, so in a resemblance more remarkable yet, he recognised his spiritual kinship with his incandescent young pagan. Violet, he thought, had once been like that, but this love had come which in some way had altered her, giving her a mysterious, fatiguing depth, a dim, tiresome profundity into which she seemed to want to drag him to. All her charm, her beauty were hers still, but they got tinged and stained with this tedious gravity. She had lost the adorable soullessness which knew no instinct beyond its own desire, and on which no frost of chill morality had ever fallen. Colin had been hospitable towards Nino's glass. The boy was becoming fawn and bacchant in one. He ought to have had a wreath of vine leaves in his hair. It amused Colin to see how gracefully intoxication gained on him. There would be no sort of vin triste about Nino, only a livelier gesticulation to help up the difficulties of pronunciation. And then the melancholy seized Tiberius, said Nino with a great hiccup, for all that he had done, and it must be a foolish fellow, signor, who is melancholy for what he has done. I would be more likely to get the melancholy when I was old for the things I might have done and had not. And the signor is like me, I think. Yeah, thank you, no more wine. I am already half tipsy, but it is very good wine. Talk yourself sober then, Nino, said Colin, filling his glass. What then shall I tell you? Oh, Capri is in love with the signora and you, some with one and some with the other. It was thought at first that you must be brother and sister, so like are you, and both golden. You were too young, they thought, to be married. It was playtime still with you. Are you going to marry, Nino? Asked Colin. There is time yet. Presently, perhaps. I do not reap in spring. There spoke the fawn, the woodland, the drinker of sweet beverages, who drank with filled cup till the drink was done, and wiped his mouth and smiled and was off again. By a luxury in contrast, Colin envisaged Violet lying white and cool in the room above, sleeping, perhaps, already in answer to the suggestive influence of his wish, while he below breathed so much more freely in this atmosphere of fawns, where nothing was wicked and nothing was holy, and love was not an affair of swimming eyes and solemn mouth. Love was a laugh. Nino, the handsome boy, no longer existed for him in any personal manner. Nino was just part of the environment, a product and piece of the joyous paganism with which the night was thick. The pale blue flower of the plumbago that clothed the southern wall of the house nodded in the open window frame. The stir of the wind whispered. The starlight with the moon lately risen, all strove to be realized, and Nino seemed some kind of bilingual interpreter of them. No, more than that, who being boy spoke with human voice, and being fawn spoke the language of nature, cruel and kindly nature, who loved joy and was utterly indifferent to sorrow. She went on her course with largesse for lovers and bankruptcy for the bilious and the Puritan. She turned her face away from pain, and with a thumb reversed condemned it. She had no use for suffering or for the ugly. The bright-eyed and the joyful were her ministers, on whatever errand they came. Thought and tenderness and any aspiration after the spiritual were her foes, for in such ascetic fashion of living there was sorrow, there was fatigue and striving. Colin was at home here, like a fish put back into water after a panting excursion into a rarefied air. His gills expanded again and drank in the tide. "And have you chosen your girl yet, Nino?" he asked. "Dio, no. I am but 20. Presently I will look about and find who is fat and has a good dowry. There is Serafina Costi. She has an older brother, but the inheritance will be hers. He passes for the son of Costi, but we all know he is no son of Costi. It was like this, Signor Colin." "Si, Signor Nino," said Colin. "Scusi, but to me you are Signor Colin." "No, with loving thanks. No more wine. My father says it is a waste to drink good wine when one is drunk. My father was boatman to your father before you and I were born. That is strange to think on. How the old oaks flourish and bear leaf still. 2 stepmothers already have I had, and there may be a third yet. Have you stepmothers, Signor? I would put all old women out of the way and all old men. The world is for the young. Sometimes I think to myself, would it not be very easy to put my hands around my father's neck and squeeze again and wait until he was still, and then leave him thus and go to bed? They would find him there in the morning. Perhaps I should be the first to find him, and it would be said that he had died in his chair, all cool and comfortable. Colin was conscious of some rapturous surprise at himself and his appreciation of the evening as it was, compared with the evening as it might have been. Normally he would have played a couple of games at piquet with Violet, and thereafter have drowsily rejoined her. There would have been whispers of love, and then sleep. All that was already routine to him. Instead, he, through the medium of this wonderful fawn, was finding himself, and that was so much better than finding Violet. Nino, with her swift gesticulations, was showing him not Nino, but himself. But by now the boy was getting extremely drunk. The vision was clouding over. It was time for just another question or two. "But aren't you afraid of Satana?" asked Colin. "If you kill your father?" "Why should I be afraid? Satana is a good friend to me and I to him. Why should we fall out, he and I?" Those full eyes drooped, and, as on this morning, the lashes swept the brown cheek. "Nino, you must go to bed," said Colin. "Si, signor. But I doubt if I could carry myself down to the marina tonight. I have the legs of the old woman, as I shall know when I come to stand up. May I sleep myself sober in your garden beside the cistern? 'Tis the signor's fault, scusi, that I am thus. My fault for taking, but his for giving." Colin rapidly pondered this. Should Violet be wakeful and open her Venetian blinds, she would surely see him there. He pointed to the sofa against the wall. "Lie down there, Nino," he said, "and I will bring you a rug. You'll be more comfortable than on the gravel. You must be off before dawn. Just wait a minute." Colin kicked off his shoes so as not to disturb Violet, ran upstairs and peeped into her room. There was silence and stillness there. Going into his dressing room next door, he picked up a folded rug off his bed and went downstairs with it. Nino was bowed over the table, helpless and inert. Colin choked down a spasm of laughter within him. "Nino, wake up for a minute," he said. "Put your arm around my neck and let me lay you down." "Oh, do as I tell you, Nino." Nino leaned his whole weight on Colin's encircled neck and was laid down on the sofa. Colin loosed the smart tie with which he had adorned himself for this visit to the villa, and unbuckled his leather belt, and taking out a 10-lira note from his purse, he thrust it into Nino's breast pocket. "I've put 10 liras in your pocket, Nino. Don't forget." "But that is too much, signor," murmured Nino with a guarding hand on his pocket. "Not for such an agreeable evening. Good night. I shall want you and your boat again tomorrow morning." "Sicuro. Felice notte, signor." Colin went up to bed with no desire for sleep, for his blood tingled and bubbled in his veins. He wished now, amusing though it had been, that he had not made Nino tipsy so soon, for he longed to continue holding up the mirror to himself. In that reflecting surface he could see much that he had only suspected in himself, and this Nino unwaveringly confirmed. Never, till Nino had so gaily asserted that he did not fear the devil, for the devil was his very good friend, had Colin so definitely realized that, whatever the truth about his Elizabethan ancestor might be, he had accepted the legend as his own experience. Twice before had some inkling of this come into his mind. Once, while lying here and listening to his father's footfall on the terrace below, he had realized that hate was as infinite as love. And once again this afternoon, when betwixt sleeping and waking on the top of Monte Solaro, he had received the impression of taking part in some dream-like colloquy. But on both these occasions he had but built in abstractions and imaginings. Tonight Nino had showed him himself in the concrete. Ah, how good it was to be so well looked after, to have this superb youthful vitality, this rage for enjoyment, above all never to be worried and perplexed by any conflict of motives, never to feel the faintest striving towards a catalogue of tedious aspirations, to take and never to give, to warm your hands at the glowing fires of fate, and stoke those fires with the dry rubbish called love. It was worth any price to secure immunity from these aches and pains of consciousness. Colin announced to Violet his intention of taking his lunch down to the bathing place next morning and having his siesta there. And he saw with impatient amusement that she instantly put out of sight the fact that she would spend a solitary day and thought only of him. "That will be lovely for you," she said. "You'll get a long enough bathe for once and not have to break it off to get back to lunch." "And what will you do?" he asked. "Think of you enjoying yourself," said she. Colin marvelled in silence. That was a good instance of the change in Violet. In the old days she would at the most have acquiesced if argument was useless. Now the only argument that seemed to have any weight with her was his enjoyment. Anyway, they were at one about that. Colin spent a most satisfactory day. There was Nino waiting for him at the marina, rather heavy-eyed but looking precisely as a bacchant should after a characteristic night. "You were wonderfully drunk last night, Nino," said Colin, as they pushed off over the waveless bay. Nino grinned. "Molto, molto," he said cheerfully. "But I slept well, and I shall bathe, and then it will be as if I had drunk no more than a glass of water." "And will you confess that to the priest?" asked Colin. "It may have gone from my mind," said Nino. "God only remembers everything. Indeed, I do not know much about last night, but that I enjoyed myself." "That's all that is worth remembering about anything," remarked Colin. A long bathe followed, and a bask on the beach, and again a bathe. Then came lunch, lying in a strip of shadow and stories from Nino, and sleep, and it was not till late in the afternoon that Colin found himself reluctantly loitering back to the villa where Violet awaited him. He beguiled himself with wondering what he would do if she were not there, if, as in some fairy tale, she had disappeared, leaving no trace behind. But hardly had he come within sight of the white garden wall than he saw her out on the balcony of his room. She waved at him as if she had gone there to catch the first sight of him, and then disappeared. Next moment she was at the garden gate, walking down to meet him. Was there news, perhaps, from England? Raymond? His father? "What is it?" he asked as he came within speaking distance. "Nothing wrong?" "Nothing right," would have expressed his thought more accurately. "Nothing," said she. "I only came to meet you. Nice day?" "Delicious. Long bathe, good lunch, long sleep, stories from Nino." Colin hesitated a moment. He was rather curious to see what Violet would think of last night. "Nino's an amusing youth," he said. "He came up here, as I told you, for the money I owed him, so I gave him a glass of wine. 2, in fact. He told me the most horrible tales about Tiberius and others, and then got frightfully drunk. He simply couldn't walk, and slept on the sofa in the dining room." "Oh, Colin, how disgusting," said she. "Hope you've said you don't want his boat any more." "I've said nothing of the kind. I want it every day." Violet had nothing to say to this, and Colin felt his irritation at her rising. "Well, what is it?" he said. "Why shouldn't Nino get drunk?" "But you shouldn't have let him, Colin," said she. "It's coarse." "But I come of a low family," said he. "Viaggi one side and Stanier on the other. How many generations of Staniers have got drunk most nights of their lives?" Violet stopped at the gate. "What would you think of me, Colin, if I took that little girl who helps in the kitchen and made her drunk?" she asked. "I should think you a very odd young woman," said Colin. "But I should be all for your doing what you wanted to." "Whatever it is? Don't you think so? Most people don't want to do anything at all. Certainly better to do anything than nothing. You may make Maria drunk as often as you please, provided you assure me that you really like it." "I infer that you liked making Nino drunk." Colin clapped his hands. "Bravo," he said. "You've guessed right. I wanted to find out when Nino was most himself, tipsy or sober. And now I know that it is sober. I shan't make him drunk again. I long to see pure fawnishness, but Nino sober is fawnier than Nino drunk." "Fawnishness?" asked she. "Yes, joyful, immoral, wicked, lovely nature, without a rag to cover, not its shame but its glory. Nino was naked sober. He was too heavenly last night before the coarseness. He thought of killing his father because he keeps giving him stepmothers and is generally rather in the way. When I asked him if he weren't afraid of the devil, he said, "Why should I be? The devil is a very good friend to me." Wasn't that queer? Just as if he were a Stanier. I felt as if Nino were my brother. Well, of course he could never supplant Raymond in my heart. But then Raymond's my twin. That's why we are so wrapped up in each other. Violet felt as if some light-winged creature was settling on her, now here, now there, and stinging her. Just so did Colin make her wince. And as for the wickedness, or coarseness, was it not, of making anyone drunk, he added, I don't agree with you. If people are most really themselves when they are rather tipsy, they should be rather tipsy as often as possible. When is Uncle Ronald at his best? Why, when his dear nephew has been sitting by him after dinner and filling up his glass for him. Let's have tea. Oh dear, I can't do it right. I did wrong to tell you about Raymond yesterday, and did wrong to tell you about Nino today. I shall lead a double life, darling, and tell you nothing. Dimly, as he spoke, Violet was aware of some reverberation of dismay that his words and his manner stirred in her. Was Colin really like that? Were those light words just jibes and jokes, not very pleasant ones, or were they authentic glimpses of himself? It seemed that her very faith was at stake. At all costs she must refuse to acknowledge so unthinkable a possibility. That could not be Colin. He was just teasing her. She must reply with the same outrageousness. Darling, lead more than a double life, she said. Such lots of people do that. Lead 3 or 4. I shall do the same. We'll have as many lives as a cat between us. Now tell me some of Nino's stories, or I shall be afraid that they weren't what Mother might call quite nice. I don't think for a moment she would call them quite nice, said he. The month of Indian summer, with warm days and windless nights, passed by in golden procession. But now, with the deepening of autumn, the ponente from the west, veering sometimes to a chillier quarter, sucked the basking out of the bathing, and the evenings grew long with the passage into November. The sunshine lost its force, rain was scribbled across it, the grey sea clouds expunged it, the wind roared in it. It was like passing out of daylight into some dank and dripping tunnel, where windows are closed and voices silent, and the magic of the day is quenched. More tunnel-like even was a certain darkness that fell between the two yet on their honeymoon, and in that darkness they drew apart like strangers. They were just passengers who had chanced to be together in the same compartment. To Violet, that darkness consisted of her own ignorance, or so she felt it, of what Colin really was, and in proportion as she began to guess at him, it grew of more nightmare-like impenetrability. He had his moods of entrancing charm, of eager affection, but now these seemed more like some will-o'-the-wisp dancing above a marsh, than a flame that, while it consumed, yet fed her and warmed her. His light was not meant for her, it only happened to fall on her. She was in the circle of its brightness. She could not avoid pursuing the thought and seeing where it led her. She could see no change in him. She perceived that he had always been like this, and that it was her own light, so to speak, the illumination of her love, which had revealed him to her. She began to question who or what it was that shed that charm and evoked that enchantment, and shuddered at her own conjecture. Hints as to that came from other quarters. There was his complete indifference as to his father's health. And true, Lord Yardley had told him not to worry, for there was no cause for that. But how could the son of so devoted a father be so immune to any sort of anxiety? Not less significant was his attitude towards Raymond, that namely of contemptuous hate. He despised Raymond, that was clear, for his failure to kill him. He hated him, not for having made his attempt, so much as for being Raymond. And there was a puzzle for Violet. Raymond, from what Colin had told her, could now never stand in his way. and at Lord Yardley's death he would simply cease to exist as an obstacle to all that Colin desired. But Colin still hated. It was just the fact of Raymond, not the fact of Raymond having planned to kill him. And there indeed was a true flame burning. Colin's feeling about Raymond had an authentic heat of its own. Hate, in fact, was real to him in a way that love was not. There was yet one more puzzle. Colin was determined to spend the night at the house of the British consul in Naples. Not once or twice only, but constantly he alluded to this. If he wanted it, Violet knew that he would get it. For herself it made no great matter. She considered Mr. Cecil a little red bounder, as Colin had phrased it, and could not understand his insistence on the point. He got impatient now, when he having alluded to their night in Naples, she asked why he wanted it, and his answer, the same as ever, that it would please Mr. Cecil, who was a useful little red bounder, carried no conviction. There was something behind, and she could not conceive what it was. The day of their departure was still uncertain, when a second morning of driving rain caused Colin to come down to breakfast with his mind made up. "It's quite intolerable," he said. "Capri without the heat and sun is like a pantomime without the fairies. What a cursed place! It only exists in the summer. Let's go today, Vi. We'll catch the midnight boat." "But it goes in 2 hours," said she. "The sooner the better." "But, darling," she said. "Oh, Lord, throw your things into your boxes and sit on them, darling," said Colin. "If they are spoiled, you shall have new ones. But I can't endure this island any more. We ought to have left before the weather broke instead of stopping on." "But I really don't think I can be ready," she said. "Besides, you wanted to stay the night with Mr. Cecil. You can't pounce on him." "As a matter of fact, I've just sent Giuseppe down to the telephone office to say that we shall arrive tonight," said Colin. Violet felt a justifiable rebellion at this. She choked it down with a not very convincing lightness. "But, darling, you're being too autocratic," she said. "How would it be if you went and I called you up tomorrow? Then you could have your adorable Mr. Cecil all to yourself." Colin turned on her with a blaze of white fury in his eyes. Of that she caught one glimpse, authentic and terrifying. Then, as if by some magical and instantaneous solvent, it melted before he spoke into his most charming mood. "I know I oughtn't to have telephoned, darling, until I consulted you," he said. "But it's your fault. You've spoiled me. You've made me think that if I want to do a thing very much, you'll agree to it. I apologize. It was stupid of me. Now, if you really don't want to come, just say so, and I shall run down to the town and reverse my first message if it is gone. It should be exactly as you like." Violet had to take one moment to steady herself. That glimpse of Colin, the most complete she had had yet of something that lay below, had gripped her very soul with terror. That stabbed at her and passed, and from whence it had come she knew not, or whither it had gone. Only Colin remained. "My dear, of course I'll come," she said. "Ah, that's delicious of you," said he. She went upstairs to tell her maid to pack everything at once, as they were off this morning. She found her knees trembling with the effect of that moment of abject terror. But already in its vanishing it had taken away with it any impression that could be analysed. Just that stroke, stunning as a blow, and then Colin again. End of section 11. Section 12 of Colin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Colin by E.F. Benson. Book 2, Chapter 9. For many years now, with Philip Yardley a widower and his mother old, Stanier had withdrawn itself from the splendour of its traditional hospitalities. But now, with the installation of Violet and Colin there on their return from Italy, it blossomed out again into lavish and magnificent flower. Throughout November a succession of parties assembled there for the pheasant shooting, and in the early frosts of that December the wild fowl, snipe and duck and teal in the marshes, and the unprecedented abundance of woodcock in the park gave an added lustre to the battues. In the evening, after an hour's concert or some theatrical entertainment for which the artistes had come from London or Paris, the band reassembled in the long gallery, and dancing kept the windows bright almost till the rising of the late dawn. There were many foreign royalties in England that year, and none left without a visit to Stanley, accompanied by cousins of the English house. Stanley, in fact, opened its doors as in the days before the stroke fell on Philip's father, and fairly outshone its own records for magnificence. Colossal in extravagance, there was yet nothing insensate in its splendour. It shone, not for purposes of dazzling, but only as reasserting its inherent and historical gorgeousness. Violet seemed born to the position which she now occupied. While Colin's father lived, it was his pleasure that she should be hostess here, and she picked up the reins and drove the great gold coach along as if she had been born and trained all her life for that superb role. She and Colin, at Philip's wish, occupied the wing which was only tenanted by the heir and his wife, and though at his death, so he supposed, they would not step from porch to possession, he loved to give them this vicarious regency. Out of the silver safe there had come for her the toilet set by Paul Lamarie, boxes and brushes, candlestick and spirit lamp, and above all, the great square mirror mounted on a high base. Amorini of chiselled metal supported it on each side. There was no such piece known in museum or royal closet. A double cable band encircled the base, and the man who was in charge of the plate showed Colin how, by pressing a stud on the cable just above the maker's mark, the side of the base sprang open, disclosing a secret drawer. For some reason, not even known to himself, Colin had not passed on that curious contrivance to Violet. Then Philip had brought out for her, as Colin's wife, those incredible jewels which his mother, tenant for life, had long suffered to repose in their chests, and one night she gleamed with the Stanley pearls, another she smouldered among the burning pools of the rubies, another she flashed with the living fire of those cascades of diamonds, and more than once she wore the sapphire to which so strange a story was attached. Some said it had once belonged to the regalia, and that Elizabeth had no more right to give it to her favourite, who founded the splendour of today, than she had to bequeath to him the sceptre of her realm. But though twice an attempt had been made on the part of the crown to recover it, once at Elizabeth's death, and once with the coming of the German dynasty, the crown had not proved successful on either of those inauspicious occasions, and had to content itself with what it had. This great stone was of 412 carats in weight, soft cornflower blue in colour, and matchless in aqueous purity. How it had got among the crown jewels none knew, but its possession was even then considered a presage and a fulfilment of prosperity, for beyond doubt Elizabeth had worn it on her withered breast every day while her fleet was sailing to encounter the Armada. By tradition, the wearer was decked with no other jewels when it blazed forth, and indeed its blue flame would have withered any lesser decoration. It figured in the Holbein portrait of its original possessor in the Stanley line, as a brooch to Colin's doublet, and there once more impersonating his ancestor, Colin wore it as the fancy dress ball which concluded the last of these December parties. This took place the night before Raymond came back from Cambridge. Strange undercurrents, swirling and eddying, moved so far below the surface of the splendour that no faintest disturbance reached it. Admirable as was the manner in which Violet filled her part, it was not of her that Philip thought, or at her that he looked, while he waited with her and Colin for the entrance of royal visitors before dinner in the great hall. Day after day the glass doors were opened, but to his way of thinking it was neither for Violet nor for them that they swung open, but for Colin. His own life he believed to be nearly consumed, but about the ash of it there crept red sparks, and these too were Colin's. All his emotions centred there. It was for him and his matchless charm that these great gatherings were arranged. Philip obliterated himself and feasted his soul on the sight of Colin as Lord of Stanley. While Raymond lived, that could never come to pass, but he beguiled himself with the fantasy that when his own eyes grew dim in death, Colin's splendour would light the halls from which he himself had faded. That of all the material magnificence of which he still was master had power to stimulate him. Sceptical of any further future for himself, and incurious as to what that might be, if it existed at all, the only future he desired was for the son on whom all his love was centred. He knew that he was cheating himself, that this sight of Colin playing host at Stanier was one that in all human probability would never after his death be realized, but it was in his power now to give Colin a taste of it, and he himself to share its sweetness. For this reason, he had arranged that these gorgeous weeks of entertainment should take place before Raymond got back from Cambridge, for with Raymond here, Raymond the heavy and the unbeloved must necessarily exclude Colin from the place which his father so rapturously resigned to him. At Christmas there would be just the family party, and he would be very civil to his eldest son. Such was the course pursued by one of these undercurrents. Two others sprang from Violet, one in direct opposition to that of her father-in-law. For she knew that, so far from his death dethroning her and giving the sovereignty to Raymond, it but passed it on to her with complete impersonal possession. Could his spirit revisit these earthly scenes, it would behold her in ownership on her own account of all the titles and splendours that had been his. Raymond, there alone her knowledge marched with his desire, would be without status here, while for Colin there would be just such position as his marriage with her gave him. She, exalted now by Philip's desire to play hostess in virtue of her marriage, would be hostess indeed hereafter, and Colin host through his relationship to her. These weeks had given her a hint, a foretaste of what would be hers, and once more, as in her maidenhood, she felt that she would have made any marriage in order to robe herself thus. The splendour of what she was lent had set light to her old ambitions again, and this was all to be hers, not lent, but her own. She would enter into the fabled inheritance of the legend, that legend to which, for its very remoteness, she had never given two serious thoughts. But now, though it still wore like a cloak over its head, its unconvincing medievalism, the shape of it, vaguely outlined and indifferently regarded, had something sinister about it. It did not matter. It was only an ugly shadow in the background. But now she averted her eyes from it, instead of merely not noticing it. Here then was the second undercurrent, which, sluggish and veiled, yet steadily moved within her. For though with the passing of the inheritance to her, it would be she who came within the scope and focus of the legend, which frankly, when looked in the face, presented that meaningless age-worn countenance, she felt that she was in the grip of it not directly, but somehow through Colin. She told herself that by no combination of diabolical circumstance could that be, for with the knowledge that was hers about the date of Colin's birth and his mother's marriage, it was he and Raymond who had passed out of the reach of the parchment with its promises and its penalty. Yet instinct, unconvinced by reason, told her that it was through Colin that she and the children she would bear him would be swept into the mysterious, incredible eddy. Was it the persistent luck that attended him which induced so wildly superstitious a presage? Like some supernaturally protected being, he passed along his way. Raymond's attempt to kill him had, by the merest most fortuitous circumstance of a punctured tire, led to Raymond's utter helplessness in his hands. Colin moved on a charmed pilgrimage, idolized and adored by herself, by his father, by all who came in contact with him, and she was beginning to see he had no spark of love in him that was kindled by these fires. Analyze him, and she would find no faintest trace of it. Perhaps, in spite of his 21 years, now so nearly complete, he had remained a child still in respect of the heart's emotions. Yet who could hate like Colin? Who, so she shuddered to think, could have shown, though but for a second, so white-hot a mask of fury as he had once turned on herself. She could not succeed in forgetting that, and all Colin's warmth and eagerness of affection to her ever since could not wash that out. All day, perhaps in the hospitable discharge of their duties, they would scarcely have a word together. But when, at length, for a few hours of rest, the house grew silent, he sought her side, relaxed and sleepy, yet tingling, so she felt, with some quality of vitality that no one else had a spark of. Youth and high spirits, the zest of life, and the endless power of enjoyment filled the house. But Colin, alone, unwearied and eminent as the sun, lit up all others. It was not the exuberance of his health and energy that was the source of his burning. Something inspired them. The last night had come. Tomorrow morning their guests would depart, and during the day Raymond would arrive. That night there had been the fancy dress ball, and she, wearing the crown and necklace and girdle made by Cellini, had impersonated the ill-fated Duchess of Milan, for whom they were made, and who, while wearing them, had drunk the poisoned draught which she had herself prepared for her lover. Colin adored that story. The lover, a mere groom of the chambers, he averred, was a sort of old Colin Stanier. All prospered with him, even to the removal of his mistress in this manner, for she was growing old and wearied him with her insatiable desire. Colin himself had appeared as his ancestor, wearing the great sapphire. Violet had undressed and got into bed, while he remained downstairs with the 2 or 3 men who still lingered. The Cellini jewels lay on her dressing-table, and feeling too sleepy to plait her hair, she had just let it down, and it lay in a spread web of gold over her pillow. Then the door from his dressing-room softly opened, and he looked in. "Not asleep?" he asked. "No, but nearly. Oh, Colin, stand under the light a moment. There. The sapphire is alive tonight. It's like a blue furnace of flame. Now shield it from the light." Violet sat up in bed. "But it's the most extraordinary thing," she said. "Not a ray from the lamp touches it, yet it's burning as brightly as ever. Where does the light come from? It comes from below it. I believe it comes from you. I'm frightened of you. Are you a fire?" It seemed to him no less than her that some conflagration not lit from without burnt in the heart of the stone. Blue rays generated within shot from it. It shone with some underlying brilliance, as if, as she said, it was he who kindled it. "Watch it, then," he said, unbuckling his cloak. Even as he detached it from him, the fire in it grew dim. Only the reflection from outside fed it. Incredulous at what she thought she saw, willing to attribute it to some queer effect of faceted surfaces, she laughed. "You killed it," she said. "I think I shall have to give it to you when it's mine, so that you may keep it alive." "Ah, do," he said, "when you come into your own. May that day be far distant." "Indeed, yes," she said. He sat down on the edge of his bed, and began unloosing the jewelled buttons of his doublet. "I believe my father would almost give it me now," he said, "though I suppose he has no right to, just as Elizabeth gave it to the other Colin. I simply adore it. I've been saying my prayers to it, standing in front of the picture." "Is that what has kept you?" she asked. "No, they didn't take me long. The prince kept me. He wanted to hear the whole of the legend. He was frightfully impressed. He said he felt as if the original Colin had been telling it him, and expects nightmare. He also besought me to swear allegiance when I come of age, and see what happens. I really think I shall, though, after all, I haven't got much to complain of in the way of what the world can give." "But it will be I, really, to choose whether I do that or not," said Violet. "Well, I couldn't tell him that," said Colin. "Though as a matter of fact I forgot it. In any case, it isn't I to do that. Raymond's the apparent heir apparent, and dear Raymond has shown his allegiance pretty well already, though one doesn't quite see why Satan made my bicycle tire to puncture. If he had been on Raymond's side, my face would have been nearly blown to bits. No, Raymond's not his favourite. Fancy Raymond being anybody's favourite. Oh, Vi, 1,000 pardons. He was yours, just for a little. Colin was slowly undressing as he gave utterance to these reflections. He had taken off his shirt, and his arms, still brown from the tanning of the sun and sea, were bare to the shoulder. "You brute, Colin," she said. "You brown, bare brute." "Shall I address again?" said he. "If a bare arm shocks you." "No, I don't mind that. It's the brute I object to. By the way, Raymond comes tomorrow. Today, rather. How on earth can I behave to him with decency? Don't you wish he wasn't coming?" Colin picked up a long tress of her hair and wound it round his arm. "No, I'm looking forward to his coming," he said, smiling. "I'm going to make Raymond wish that he had never been born. I'm going to be wonderfully agreeable to him, and everything I say shall have a double meaning. Raymond wanted to kill me. Well, I shall show him that there are other ways of scoring off people. My father isn't very fond of Raymond as it is. When he sees how pleasant I am to him, and how black and sulky Raymond is to me, he won't become any fonder of him. I must think it all out. And then all the time Raymond will be consoling himself with the thought that when father dies, his day will come, and he will reign in his stead. There's the cream of it, Vi. He'll be longing for my father to die, you know, and when he does, Raymond will be worse off than ever. And you once said, 'Poor Raymond,' to me. Raymond's got to pay for that. I won't have Raymond pitied." Never had Colin worn a more radiant face than when, walking in and out of his dressing-room, brown and lithe, as he divested himself of his gorgeous dress and put on his night-clothes, his beautiful mouth framed itself to this rhapsody of hatred. There was nothing passionate about it, except its sincerity. It did not rage and foam on the surface of his nature. He but gleamed with the fire that seemed so strangely to have lit up those wonderful rays in the sapphire that he had been wearing. He still held it in his hand, when, after having turned out the lights in his dressing-room, he closed the door and sprang to her side. "I don't like to leave it alone," he said. "I must pin it to the pillows, to watch over us. With you and it by me, I shall lie in an enchantment between waking and sleeping, floating on the golden sea of your hair. Raymond. Let's make plans for Raymond." She lay in the warm tide of his tingling vitality, and soon fell asleep. But presently she tore herself out of the clutch of some hideous vision, which faded from vagueness into non-existence as she woke, and heard his breathing, and felt his cheek resting on her shoulder. The next night, instead of the long cloth which evening after evening had stretched from the window of the great dining-room to the Elizabethan sideboard at the other end, there was spread near the fire, for the night was cold, a small round table that just held the 5 of them, Philip and his mother, Violet, Raymond, and Colin. And instead of the rows of silver sconces in the dark panels, 4 red-shaded candlesticks, sufficient for purposes of knife and fork, left the rest of the room in a velvety dimness. Raymond had arrived only just in time to dress for dinner, coming into the gallery but half a minute before his father, while Colin, who all this week had been a model of punctuality, had not appeared yet. Philip gave his arm to his mother, and behind, unlinked, came Violet and Raymond. He had advanced to her with elbow formally crooked, but she, busy with a sleeve-lace that had caught in her bracelet, moved on apart from him. She had shaken hands with him and had given him a cool, cordial word, but she felt incapable of more than that. Philip sat down with a sigh of relief. "A reasonable evening at last," he said, "though I wouldn't say that if Colin were here. I believe he got fresher and livelier every day. Ah, Raymond, you must know we've had some parties here. Colin took your place, as you had to be at Cambridge." Raymond tried to put into his answer the geniality he did not feel. I know," he said. "The daily picture papers have been full of Colin. Are you having more people at Christmas, Father?" "No, just ourselves as usual." Raymond turned to Violet. "You had a fancy dress ball last night, didn't you?" he said. "I could have got down yesterday if I had known." Philip conjectured a reproach in this and resented it. The last few weeks had been planned by him as Colin's show. If Colin could not step into his shoes while he was dead, he could wear them for a week or two while he lived. I thought your term was not over until today, he said. I could have got leave, replied Raymond, but I understand, Father. Philip felt rising at him that ceaseless regret that Colin was not his firstborn, and that jealousy of Colin implied in Raymond's "I understand" irritated his father. He wanted Colin to come and relieve the situation, as he always did. "What exactly do you mean by that?" he asked. Suddenly old Lady Yardley joined in. "I know what he means, Philip," she said. "He means that he should have been host here if you were going to depute one of your sons to do the honours for you, that you preferred that Colin should do them instead. That is what he means." "There, mother, that's enough," said Philip. An embarrassed silence ensued, broken by the sound of running steps in the gallery. Just as they arrived at the door, which one of the footmen opened, there was a loud crash, and Colin slid in on his back, and had begun to laugh before he picked himself up. "Gosh, what a bang!" he said. "I believe somebody greased the boards in the hope that I should be in a hurry and fall down. Sorry, Father. Sorry, Granny. Sorry, Violet, for upsetting all your nerves. Why, Raymond!" Colin laid his hand affectionately on his brother's shoulder. "I never knew you had come," he said. "How are you, dear Raymond? How's Cambridge? We have missed you and all this hullabaloo. Everyone asked after you and wanted to know why you weren't here." Colin took the vacant place between Violet and his grandmother. "How far have you all got?" he said. "Oh, very well, I won't have any soup. Now this is jolly. Just ourselves, Granny, and short coats and black ties. Vi, darling, why didn't you come and pull me out of my bath? I was just lying soaking there. I had no idea it was so late." Colin spared one fleeting glance at his brother, began to put into words some of the things he had thought about in his bath. "Raymond, it is time that you came home," he said. "The pigeons are worse than ever in the old park, and I'm no earthly use at that snap shooting between the oaks. Give me a rabbit coming towards me along a road, not too fast, and a rest for my gun, I can hit it in the face as well as anybody. But those pigeons among the oaks beat me." "Yes, we might have a morning in the old park tomorrow," said his father. Colin looked at Violet as if she had called his attention to something. "Yes, Vi? What?" he asked. "Nothing." "Oh, I thought you jogged my elbow." "Tomorrow, Father? Oh, what a bore. I promised to play golf, but I shall be back by 1 if I go on my motor bicycle. May I join you at that sharp corner in the road? That's about halfway to the keeper's lodge, and I could come on with you from there." "But that corner is at the far end of the old park," said his father. "Is it? The one I mean has a big rhododendron bush close to it. You know where I mean, Raymond? Is it at the far end?" "Yes, that's the far end," said Raymond. "I believe you're right." "Of course you are right, and I'm idiotic. It's where I picked you up one day in the autumn when you had been after the pigeons." Colin applied himself to his dinner and caught the others up. "There's something in my mind connected with that day," he said, "and I can't remember what it is. I'd been playing golf, and I punctured, and walked back along the ridge instead of wheeling my bicycle along the road. Something funny. I can remember laughing. Vi, darling, can't you remember? Or didn't I tell you?" Violet saw that even in the red glow of the candle shades, Raymond's face had turned white. There was red light upon it, but not of it. "You certainly did not tell me," she said in sheer pity. "I remember the day too. There was a man who had escaped from the asylum and had stolen a gun from the keepers." "Yes, that's right," said Colin. "I believe that's on the track. A man with a gun." Philip laughed. "One of the most amusing things I ever heard, Colin," he said. "I'm surprised at Violet's forgetting it. Is that all?" Colin turned to his grandmother. "Granny, they're all laughing at me because I can't remember. Father's laughing at me, so is Violet. You and Raymond are the only kind ones. Man with a gun, bicycle, Raymond shooting pigeons. That makes 2 men with a gun. And then there was me." "The very best story, Colin. Most humorous," said his father. Colin sighed. "Sometimes I think of things just as I'm going to sleep," he said. "If I think of it tonight, I shall wake Violet and tell her, and then she'll remember if I can't. Man with a gun? Oh, Colin, stop it," said Violet. "Well, let's put it to the vote," said Colin. "Father and Violet want me to stop trying to remember it. Little do they know how it would amuse them if I did. Granny and I want me to go on, don't you, dear? It all depends on Raymond. What shall I do, Ray?" Raymond turned to his father, appearing not to hear Colin's question. "Did you have good sport last week?" he asked. "Ah, Raymond votes against us, Granny," said Colin. "He's too polite to tell me directly. We're squashed, Granny. We'll squash him at whist afterwards. You and I shall be partners, and we'll play Raymond and Father for their immortal souls. It'll be like the legend, won't it? Violet will look on and wonder whether her poor husband is going to heaven or hell. I keep my immortal soul in a drawer close to Violet's bedside, Granny. So if we lose, she will have to go up to her bedroom and bring it down. Oh, I say, I'm talking too much. Nobody else can get a word in edgeways." It was a fact that the other four were silent, but Raymond had the faculty of producing silence in his neighbours. Cigarettes had come now with coffee, and this was the usual signal for old Lady Yardley to rise. Tonight, however, she took no notice of the gold-mounted stick which was put into her hand by Philip. "Never mind them, my dear," she said. "They are amusing themselves. Listen to me, Colin." There was no other voice in the room but hers. The servants had gone out. And again she spoke. No one moved. No one spoke. But Raymond opposite her leaned forward. Violet leaned leftwise. Philip, with her stick in his hand, leaned to the right. She dropped her voice to a whisper, but in the tense stillness a shout could not have been more audible. "There are strange things in this house, darling," she said to Colin. "I have been here 60 years, and I know better than anybody. Greenleaf I have been, and flower and fruit, and now I am withered. 60 years ago, my dear, I sold my soul to the master of it, and from that moment I have been a ghost. Oh, such a happy ghost, looking on at the glory of the house. And then my son Philip married, and he brought you here, and the moment I set eyes on you I loved you, for I knew you were born of the blood and the bargain." Philip drew back in his chair and got up. "There's your stick, mother," he said. "We'll follow you quite soon. It'll be too late for your game of whist." She fumbled for the crook of the handle and rose. Her eyes were as bright and as blue as the sapphire Colin had worn last night. "Yes, but I must talk to Colin again," she said. "No one understands me except Colin. There used to be other games than whist, Philip, at Stanier. There was dice throwing, you know, on the altar of God. We're not so wicked now, to all appearance. Whist in the gallery. Far more seemly." Raymond held the door open for her, and she hobbled through, Violet following. As she passed out, Violet looked first at Raymond, and then swiftly away with a shudder at Colin. "Don't be long, Uncle Philip," she said in a low voice. "Grandmamma is so queer tonight." Colin moved up next his father. "Give me a glass of port, Father," he said. "Here's Raymond back, and I'm so glad to see him. Your health, Ray." He drank off his glass. "Father, isn't it lovely to have Raymond back again?" he said. "But this is an aside. He's putting on flesh. May your shadow not grow more, Raymond. Tell us about Cambridge. Has it been delightful? I'm sure it has, for otherwise you wouldn't look so prosperous. Speech. Mustn't we have a speech from him, Father?" There, on one side of Philip, was Colin, brimming with good humour and welcome, brimming too, as he had shown during dinner, with the mere nonsense born of happiness. On the other side was Raymond, serious and unresponsive, without a spark to answer this crackling fire. There he sat, and what sort of host would he have made during these last weeks? He made no attempt to reply to Colin, and but fingered the stem of his glass. "You might tell us what has been going on, Raymond," said his father. "Nothing particular. Just the ordinary term. I've been playing for the university at soccer. I shall probably be in the team." "And you never told us," said Colin. "Lord, what a swell he is, Father. We are not worthy to hear about it. That's what is the matter with us." Philip turned to Raymond. "That's good," he said. "That's pleasant news. There's Colin here who won't do anything more violent than golf." "Oh, Father, what about shooting pigeons?" said Colin. Oh, no, Raymond did that. Bother! There was a man with a gun? Philip got up. Now don't get on to that again, he said. You've amused us enough for one night. But I may amuse Vi, mayn't I, if I think of the rest of it? Asked Colin. Philip turned his back on him and took Raymond's arm. He had the sense of behaving with great fairness, but the impartiality demanded effort. Ring the bell, Colin, will you? He said over his shoulder. I'm delighted to hear about your success in the football field, Raymond. Games are taking the place of sport in this generation. Your Uncle Ronald and I never played games. There was shooting, there was riding. Oh, but there's lots of sport still, said Colin. Big game, Father. Large animals, not footballs, things that feel. And then my bicycle punctured. Oh, you wanted me to ring? At this rite of whist for the sake of old Lady Yardley, it was necessary that one of the five should cut out. She herself and Philip took no part in this chance. The rite was that both should play if there was not another table to be formed. Raymond turned the highest card, and with a paper to beguile him, sat just where he had sat when one night the whist table had broken up, and he heard Colin's mimicry. As the four others cut for deal, some memory of that must have come into Colin's mind. What an awful night that was, Vi, he said, when we were playing bridge with Aunt Hester. She revoked, do you remember, and then swore she hadn't. How we laughed. Then I thought everybody else had gone to bed, and I... Good Lord, yes. Another of Colin's amusing stories, said his father. Shh, said Colin. Granny, you always turn up the ace for your trump card. Will you give me lessons? The rubber was very quickly over, and Raymond took Colin's place. Colin drew a chair up close to his brother, and instead of reading a paper in the corner, watched his hand, the play of it, with breathless attention. Raymond, you're a wizard, he said at the end of it. Every plan of yours was right. You finessed and caught the king. You didn't finesse and caught the queen. Why don't I have luck like yours? It's enough to make any fellow jealous. I shan't look at your hand any more. I shall look at Violet's. My poor wife. Raymond's got all the winning cards again. Or if he hasn't, he'll turn them into winning cards. He'll down you. Colin, if you would talk just a little less, said his father, we should be able to attend a little more. Raymond, if no one else, fully appreciated the utter absence of reproof in his father's voice. If it had been he who had been talking, there would have been at the best a chill politeness there, at the worst a withering snub. But this was the candour of friend to friend. About that signed paper now which Colin had deposited at his bank. He himself had signed some sort of mad confession that he had planned to shoot Colin. His will had bent to Colin's like hot wax to strong fingers. But could he not somehow get possession of it again? While it was in Colin's hands, it was like a toasting fork in which that devil twin of his impaled and held him before the fire. All dinner time, Colin had scorched him, and not less burning with his mocking kindliness, which made the one appeared so warmly genial and the other awkward and ungracious. How long would he be able to stand it? Presently, at the end of the rubber, Colin would join him in the smoking room and reveal another aspect, no doubt. But he could rob him of that further indulgence. He would go to bed as soon as the rubber was over. The next hand finished it, and Lady Yardley got up. She had won tonight from Colin, and clinked a couple of half-sovereigns in her hand. "But it will come back to you, darling," she said. "Everything there is will come to you if you are wise and careful. My eyes grow dim as I get older, but there is another sort of sight that gets brighter. Oh, I see very well." Philip went with her to the door. "Your eyes are wonderful yet, mother," he said. "There are years of vision in them yet." As if Colin had read Raymond's thought of going to bed, he turned to Violet. "I may be a little late tonight, darling," he said. "Raymond and I are going to have a long talk in the smoking room." "Oh, I think not," said Raymond. "I'm tired. I shall go to bed." Colin whisked round to him. "Not just yet, Ray," he said. "I haven't seen you for so long. It would be nice of you to come and have a chat. I know you will." Persuade him to do as I ask, Vi. Who knows what important things I may have to tell about? Philip rejoined them. I shall just come in and have a cigarette with you boys, he said. Good night, Violet. Ah, that's jolly, said Colin. They preceded him to the smoking room, for he turned into his own room a moment, and as soon as they were there, Colin shut the door. Father will be with us in a minute, he said, and I can only just begin my talk. But if you attempt to go to bed when he does, Raymond, I shall tell him about the morning when you shot pigeons. Oddly enough, I have remembered all about it. And tomorrow I'll telephone for the envelope I left at my bank. So it's up to you. Colin came a step closer. With such an eagerness must some Borgia Pope have looked on the white skin of the victim he had ordered to be flayed. It's jolly seeing you again, you sulky blackguard, he said. Has anyone smacked your face since I did it for you? You were going to spend the whole of the vacation here unless I get tired of you and send you away before. Ah, there's Father. Isn't it jolly, Father? Raymond hopes to spend the whole of the vacation here. Philip did not seem as enthusiastic as Colin about this, but he was adequately cordial, and having smoked a cigarette in silence, got up to go. Are you coming? He said to his sons. Colin nodded to Raymond to answer this. We're just going to have a talk first, Father, he said. Very good. Don't sit up too late. Colin hasn't been to bed till 3 for the last fortnight. Colin waited till the door was shut. Now for our talk, he said. Isn't Violet looking divine? Aren't I a lucky fellow? Even the thought of being mistress of Stanier wasn't enough to make her tolerate you. We had a lovely honeymoon, Raymond. We often talked of you. Lord, how she loathes you. I should think even you see that. Now an interesting question. I ask for information. Do you think she knows about that morning we were speaking of at dinner? I've no means of telling, said Raymond. Well, we'll assume she doesn't. Now I want you to observe her closely again tomorrow and see if you think she knows then. I've remembered all about it, and as you heard me say, I was thinking of telling her, just drowsily and quietly tonight. And then tomorrow you'll guess whether I have done so or not. Take coffee for breakfast if you think I have. Tea if you think I haven't. What a jolly Christmas game. Colin poured himself out a glass of whisky and soda. Fancy Father saying I didn't care for sport, he said. I adore the thought of the sport I'm going to have with you. You used to be rude to me when we were alone. Now you've got to be polite. I can always send for that paper which you signed and Father witnessed. Now don't be tedious and say that the condition on which you signed it was that I would not tell him. What does that matter to me? You wanted to kill me. All that I do now is in self-defence. Otherwise you might plan to kill me again. He yawned. I'm rather sleepy tonight, Raymond, he said. I thought the satisfaction of seeing you again would make me wakeful. I shall go upstairs. Violet will be pleased that I have not sat up late after all. I shall sit on her bed and talk to her. Last night her hair made a golden mat on the pillow. There is a marvellous fragrance in her hair. Do you remember that from the days, not many of them, when you used to kiss her? How she winced. Now it's your turn to wince. We shall talk about you, no doubt. And remember about the tea and the coffee tomorrow. Day after day, Colin amused himself thus. Morning after morning, Raymond had to guess whether Violet had been told, until one evening, wearying of this particular game, Colin casually mentioned that all his guessings had been superfluous, for Violet had known ever since one day on their honeymoon when she had provoked him by saying, "Poor Raymond," even as a cat with a mouse. So Colin played with him, taking no notice of him except in ordinary intercourse, for nearly a whole day, and letting him seem forgotten. Then with quivering shoulders he would spring on him again, tap him with sheathed claws and a velvet paw, or with more forcible reminder, nip him with needle-like teeth. It was useless and worse than useless for Violet to plead for him. Her advocacy, her appeal to the most elementary feeling of compassion, only exasperated Colin. "Darling, as if my brain wasn't busy enough with Raymond, you must go and add to my work like that," he said. "I've got to cure you of being sorry for Raymond as well. I thought you were cured when I told you that he tried to murder me. Just let your mind dwell on that. He planned to shoot me from behind that wall. I shall take you there tomorrow and show you the place to make it more vivid to you. One's brother must not make such plans and fail without suffering for it afterwards. Perhaps you would prefer that he had succeeded?" "Ah, I've made you shudder then." You trembled deliciously. "I've got such a delightful Christmas present for him. A little green jade pigeon with ruby eyes. It cost a lot of money. The green, I shall explain to him, is his jealousy of me, for he's devoted to you still, and the red eyes are the colour of my blood, and the whole will remind him of that amusing morning." The new year came in with 3 nights of sharp frost, and the ice on the bathing lake grew thick enough to bear. The lake was artificial, lying in a small natural valley through which a stream ran. A dam some 12 feet high had been built across the lower end of it, in which was the sluice gate. Thus the stream, confined by the rising ground at the sides and the dam at the end, had spread itself into a considerable sheet of water, shallow where the stream entered it, but some 9 feet deep at the lower end, where was the bathing place and the header boards and pavilions for bathers. The dam was planted with rhododendron bushes, whose roots strengthened the barrier, and in summer the great bank of blossom overhung the deep water. A path ran behind them, crossing the sluice by a stone bridge with balustrade. Raymond had gone down there directly after breakfast, and came back with the news that he had walked this way and that across the ice, and that it seemed safe enough. For some reason which Colin failed to fathom, he seemed in very cheerful spirits today. It might be that the end of the Christmas vacation was approaching, when he would return to Cambridge. It might be that he, like Colin himself, had seen the rapidity with which old age was gaining on his father. There was humour in that. Raymond looked forward, and little wonder, to his own succession here, not knowing, poor shorn lamb, that he would be worse off than ever when that unpropitious event occurred. As for the remission of subtle torture which his return to Cambridge would give him, there were several days yet, thought Colin. Opportunity for much pleasant pigeon conversation. So Raymond got his skates, while Colin and Violet, sitting cosy in the long gallery, wondered whether it was worth while going out, and he went down by the long yew hedge to the lake with brisk foot and brightened eye. After all, other people besides Colin could make plans, and one of his had matured this morning into a luscious ripeness. Sleepless nights had been his, with hands squeezing for Colin's throat and dawn breaking in on the fierce disorder of his thoughts, before he had distilled his brain down to the clear broth. Wild and vagrant fancies got hold of him, goaded as he was to the verge of desperation by this inhuman persecution. Red madnesses had flashed before him like the cloaks that the matadors wave before the bull, and whether he charged or not, another ribanded dart pierced him. He had bitten his lip till the blood flowed, in order to recall himself to self-control, and to use those hours of the night when Colin was with Violet to hew out some defence to the fluttered red and the ribanded dart. There had been his handicap. Hate of Colin had made him violent, whereas Colin's hate of him had made Colin calm and self-possessed. He must cease to rage if he hoped to arrive at any plan. So night after night he had curbed himself, making his wits reduce their mad galloping to an orderly pace, and pull steadily in harness. The grass was encrusted with the jewels of frost. Every step crunched a miracle of design into powder, and now, for the first time since he had come to Stanier, Raymond fed with the braced joy of a frosty morning on the banquet which the season spread. He was hungry for it. All these days he had been starved and tortured, sick with apprehension, and shuddering at the appearance of Colin with rack and pincers. But now he was hungry again for the good things of life, and the long draught of cold air was one of them, and the treading of the earth with muscles alternately strong and relaxed was another, and the sense of the great woodlands that would in no distant future be his was a third. For how old, how rapidly aging was his father, and the congé he would soon give to Colin and Violet was a fourth, sweeter than any. How sour had turned his love for Violet, if indeed there had ever been any sweetness in it. He lusted after her, that he knew, but just because she knew the events of that morning when all had gone so awry, he thought of her as no more than a desirable mistress. Ha! There was a woodcock. In the frost of the morning it had lain so close that he had approached within 20 yards of it before it got up. He was near enough to see how it pulled itself forward, grasping a blade of grass in its reed-like bill before it could get those long wings free of the ground, where it squatted. With a flip-flap, it skidded and swerved through the rhododendron bushes. Even if he'd had a gun with him, he could scarcely have got a shot. Flip-flap. It was just so that he had escaped from Colin's barrels. Those nights of thought, when he had bandaged the eyes of rage, had given him simplicity at last. Such simplicity as Colin had so carelessly arrived at when he came through the oaks of the old park. He had trusted to the extraordinary similarity of his own handwriting to that of Colin, and had written a letter in Colin's name to Colin's bankers, requesting them to send the letter which he had deposited there last August, with the note on the outside of it, about its eventual delivery in the case of his death, to his brother Lord Stanley, whose receipt would be forwarded. Raymond knew it to be a desperate measure, but after all, nothing could be more desperate than his position here, bound hand and foot to Colin as long as that sealed envelope remained at Messrs. Bertram's. The bank might possibly make a further inquiry, telegraph to Colin for confirmation, but even if that happened, Colin was doing his worst already. No such disaster had followed. This morning Raymond had received from the bank a registered letter containing the unopened envelope, forwarded it to him by direction of Honourable Colin Stanier. So now, as he went briskly towards the frozen lake, the confession which he had signed was safe in the letter case he carried in the inside pocket of his coat, and for very luxury of living over again a mad moment which was now neutralized, he drew it out and read it. There it was. In that crisis of guilt, covered by Colin's pistol, he had consented to any terms. But now, let Colin see what would be his response when next he talked in flashes of that veiled lightning concerning a shooting of pigeons, concerning a morning when there was a lunatic at large. Indeed, Raymond determined that this very day he would fling the challenge himself. Instead of sitting dumb under Colin's blistering jibes, he would defy him. He would insult and provoke him till he was stung into sending to the bank for the famous confession, vowing an instant disclosure of the whole matter to his father. How Raymond would snap a finger in his face for that threat, and how, when Colin received the answer from the bank that the packet in question had been sent by his own orders to his brother, would he choke with the derisive laughter of hate. Who, without solid proof, would credit such a tale? Besides, Raymond had it all ready now. No doubt Lord Yardley would remember witnessing with Colin the paper about which he now impotently jabbered. Had not the brothers come in together ever so pleasantly on that morning of the pigeon shooting, and asked for his witnessing signature? That paper, so Raymond now framed it, had set forth how he determined to make a better job of brotherhood than he had hitherto done, and to realize that Violet and Colin were mated in love. And already the pact had fulfilled itself, for never had the two spent days of such public fraternal amity. Write to the bank for it in my name, Colin would be supposed to have said, and tear it up, dear Ray. It'll be fun, too, to see if they can distinguish your handwriting from mine. That was what Colin would find waiting for him if he sent to the bank for the document on which this insane accusation was based. His skates, fitted onto boots, clanked in his hand. His foot trod briskly on the frozen soil that would soon be his own. Those eye-teeth of Colin's were drawn. His father aged rapidly, and without doubt before many months the park gates would have clapped to on the final exit of Colin and his wife. Perhaps he would let Stanier to some dollar-gorged American. He had no feeling for it himself, and the other two would have bore that. Never yet had Stanier been tenanted by aliens. It was enough to make the dead turn in their graves. What was more important, it would make the living writhe. Perhaps Colin, who'd be very rich, alas, would try to take it. The would-be lessees must be closely scrutinized. So here was the lake with its stiff frozen margin, A stamp on it and a short slide over the black ice produced no cluck of remonstrance. The pavilion of the bathing place was on the other side, but a felled tree trunk made a comfortable seat for the exchange of his walking shoes into the boots with skates on them. He had spent a winter month in Switzerland 2 years before, and hungered for the bite of the blade on the sweet fodder of that black field. Instantly, as in swimming, the instinct of that balance came back to him, and with long strokes he curved out onto the delightful playground. Outside edge and a drop turn, and outside back, and a taking up of the direction with the other foot. Colin, at this moment, had made up his mind not to skate till after lunch. "I'm lazy," he said to Violet. "I'm tired of baiting Raymond. He was more cheerful than I liked this morning, Vi. I shall smoke a cigarette and think of something new. Lord, I've got no matches." There was a paper basket handy, and he drew a crumpled envelope from it, meaning to get a light with it from the log fire. Uncrumpling it, he saw it was addressed to Lord Stanier, and idly turning it over, as he made his spill, he saw the seal of his own bank. The envelope was registered. He tore a narrow strip off the edge of it, and used it for his purpose. "I should like to sit here talking to you all morning," he said, "but that beastly motor bicycle of mine has gone wrong again. I think I'll go up to the stables to see about it. Skating this afternoon, isn't it? I hate seeing Raymond skate because he's so good at it. But as I want to skate myself, what's to be done?" Colin floated off in his crisp, graceful manner, and never was he so alert as when he appeared to be loitering. Why had Raymond received a registered envelope from Bertram's? Bertram's was not Raymond's bank. What had that envelope contained? He strolled out of the front door. The stables lay to the right, but Raymond, hugely cheerful that morning, had gone to the lake, which was in the opposite direction. So, deferring the matter of the bicycle, he went down by the yew hedge and along the path on the top of the dam behind the rhododendrons. He could hear the ring of Raymond's skates on the frozen surface. Raymond would have to cease his sport and explain the matter of the envelope. Hidden by the bushes, he had nearly come to the bridge over the sluice, when from close at hand there came a noise of loud crackings and splintering across the lake, and a great splash. For one moment Colin stood quite still, his heart beating high and fast. Then with quickened pace he walked onto the bridge over the sluice. Some 10 yards out was a large hole in the surface with jagged edges. A cap and fragments of broken ice floated on it, and bubbles rose from below. "It has been carried under the ice," thought Colin. "How cold it must be! The water is deep there." What was to be done? Nothing, it seemed. He could run up to the house and get help, a rope, a plank, something to put out across that gaping hole in which the sunlight glittered, but before he could return, all hope, all chance, rather, of saving Raymond must have passed. Was there no other plan? His mind, usually so ingenious and resourceful, seemed utterly blank, save for an overwhelming curiosity as to whether Raymond would come to the surface again, just once, just for a second. As he looked, leaning on the balustrade of the bridge, Raymond's head appeared. His face was white and wide-eyed, the lips of his open mouth blue with the cold. Across those 10 yards which separated them, their eyes met. Colin's bright and sparkling with exuberant life, the others stricken with the ultimate and desperate terror. Colin waved his hand. "So you've fallen in," he said. "I'll go and see what can be done. If I'm too late, well, goodbye. Rather cold, isn't it?" The last words were spoken to emptiness. There was the cap still floating, and the stream of bubbles breaking on the surface of the sparkling water. Colin gave one leap in the air like some young colt whose limbs tingle with the joy of life, and rubbed his hands, which were chilled with leaning on the bridge. Of course it was no use going to the house. The shock and the cold and the soft smothering water would have done their work long before he could bring help, and the resources of Stanier, so powerful for the living, had no succour or consolation for the dead. Indeed, it would be better not to go to the house at all, for he could not imagine himself in this ecstatic moment simulating haste and horror and all that would be appropriate to the occasion. So, Making a circuit through the woods, he strolled 10 minutes later into the stable yard to see about his bicycle. He had a pleasant word for the groom and a joke for the motor mechanic. Just then his brain could only be occupied with trivial things. A great glittering curtain seemed to be let down across it, behind which were stored treasures and splendours. Presently, when he came to himself, he would inspect these. He showed himself to Violet and his father, who were in the long gallery when he got back to the house, said a word about his motor bicycle, hoped that Raymond was having a good time, and went into the smoking room. Now was the time to pull up that glittering curtain. Till then, the fact of Raymond's death, just the removal, the extinction of him, had hidden all that might lie behind it. Now Colin saw with an amazed gasp of interest how all the activity of his brain was needed to cope with the situation. Raymond was finished with, while his father still lived. The remote, the unexpected, the unlooked for had occurred, yet not quite unlooked for. One morning, dreaming of the Capri beach, Colin had taken this possibility into account, had let it simmer and mature in his brain, and as outcome had made Violet spend a night at the house of the British consul in Naples. How wise that had proved! He would have been grinding his teeth if he had not done that. Swiftly he ran over the whole process from the beginning, and though there were problems ahead of him, so far his course had been flawless. First had come the erasure in the consulate register, and the insertion of that single numeral in his mother's letter to Salvatore. He would have to see dear Uncle Salvatore again. That had smoothed the way for his marriage with Violet. That had ensured, even if Raymond lived to be 100, his own mastership, and that of his children after him at Stanier. It was not mastership in name, for he would be but husband to its mistress, but he knew that name alone would be lacking to the completeness of possession. He could not have provided better for the eventuality of his father's death, which, according to all human probability, would occur before Raymond's. But fate, that blind incalculable chance, had decreed otherwise. And Colin gave a frown and a muttered exclamation to the recognition of the fact that had he left the register alone and torn up instead of emending his mother's letter, he would now be heir to Stanier as he indeed truly was, in his own right. It was a pity to have devoted all that ingenuity, to have saddled himself with considerable expense as regards that troublesome Salvatore, when fate all the time was busier and wiser than he. Yet it had been necessary, and it was no use wasting regret over it. What stood in his way now was the letter and the register. With regard to the former, it was easy to destroy it, to indicate to Salvatore that all required of him was to hold his tongue, or, if necessary, to tell a mere simple truth that he had given Colin 2 letters. One, he seemed to recollect, dated March 1st, in which his sister announced her marriage, the other a fortnight later, giving news of the birth of the twins. Uncle Salvatore, with his Viaggi pride, so Colin smilingly reflected, would be glad that this stain on the family honour could be expunged. Rosina was married when she brought forth. For him, too, it was pleasant to have the bar sinister lifted from him. It would not, he allowed, have weighed heavily on him. In any case, it would have been amply compensated for by the enjoyment of Stanier and the expulsion of Raymond. But now there was no need for that ounce of bitter. So much then for the letters. They could be destroyed. Violet would ask in vain for their production to prove her possession. "What letters do you mean, darling?" he would answer. Yes, those letters should perish at once. He turned his thoughts to the register. There at this moment it reposed in that archive room, bearing the erasure so easily overlooked, so convincing when pointed out. You had but to look carefully, and so to speak, you could see nothing but the erased numeral. It stared at you. He had, it was true, in his keeping a copy of that entry, certified to be correct by Mr. Cecil, which bore the earlier date. But, now that Violet had been informed of that erasure, she would, when Stanier changed hands, insist on the production of the register, and knowing where to look and what to see, her lawyer would draw the conclusion, which even in the absence of confirming letters might easily satisfy a jury. The register had been tampered with, and in whose interests but Colin's? By what hand? without doubt by his father's. Not that that would hurt him then, or his own. There was danger, remote perhaps, but alive and smouldering on that page. It must be quenched. Colin recalled his meditations on the Capri beach, which foresaw this contingency with a vividness as clear as was the October air on that morning. All the circumstances of it were equally sharp-edged in his memory. The sense of the hot pebbles of the beach on which he lay, the sea in its crystal embrace awaiting him when he got baked and pining for its coolness. Nino, the joyous pagan boy asleep in the shade. Vesuvius across the bay with a thin streamer of smoke. That was the milieu where thought came clean and clear to you, and clean and clear that morning had his thought been, providing for this very situation. The pieces of it lay in his brain like the last few fragments of a puzzle. He had no need even to fit them together, for he could see how curve corresponded with curve, and angle with angle. All was in order, ready to be joined up, now that Raymond no longer blocked his way, and the key piece round which the others fitted was undoubtedly that visit of Violet to Mr. Cecil. Then came quick steps up the passage, and Violet burst in. "Oh, Colin," she said, "a terrible thing has happened. Uncle Philip and I walked down to the lake. Raymond was not there. His boots were on the bank. There was a hole where the ice had given way at the deep end. Uncle Philip is getting men and ropes." End of section 12. Section 13 of Colin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Colin by E.F. Benson. Book 2, Chapter 10. It was not till well on in the afternoon that the body was recovered. All day the cold had been intense, and the ropes with the tackle for this terrible fishing got stiff and frozen. But at sunset they found it. The stream had carried it along below the ice towards the sluice. Philip sat up with Colin in the long gallery when Violet and Lady Yardley had gone to bed. He felt no sorrow, for he had not liked Raymond. He had not even loved him with his fatherhood, for all that had been given to Colin. Often and often he had longed that Colin had been the eldest. Now there was none other than Colin. He would have all that his father coveted for him. But though he felt no sorrow, he felt remorse and pity. Remorse that he had not liked this dead son of his. Pity that he had died young. "I reproach myself, Colin, most bitterly," he had been saying. "It was hard to be kind to poor Raymond. He kept kindness at arm's length. But I ought to have tried more. I ought to have taken example from you. You never wearied of kindness." Colin laid his hand on his father's arm. All the evening he had been keeping things together by a tact so supreme that it appeared pure naturalness. He had talked quite freely about Raymond, recalled 100 little incidents in which Raymond was a mild hero, his shooting, his prospect of playing football for Cambridge. It was clear, too, that the tragedy had made very little impression on his grandmother, and so he had taken it for granted that they would play their rubber of whist. Why not? "You mustn't think of it like that, father," he said. "You did what you could. You made it very jolly for him here. He liked coming home. He was going to stop here the whole of the Christmas vacation, you know. If he had not been enjoying it, he would not have done that." Colin revelled in the underlying meaning of his words. How Raymond had been enjoying it, hadn't he? Philip's servant came into the room. He carried on a tray Raymond's watch and chain and a pocket-book. "I found these on his lordship's body, my lord," he said. "I thought it best to bring them you." Philip took them and looked absently at the watch, which had stopped at a few minutes to 11. "He must have fallen in almost immediately," he said. "I had better look at what's in his pocket-book. It may contain papers that must be attended to." Not until that moment had Colin given another thought to what Raymond had received that morning in the envelope from Bertram's bank. Now, in a flash, he conjectured that whatever it was, and he felt no doubt of what it was, it would be found in that pocket-book which his father even then was opening. How lucky it was that he had not told his father about that attempt of Raymond's. How splendid would appear his own magnanimity, his own unfailing kindness to him. He could emphasize them even more by a reluctance that his father should examine these remains. The water, it is true, might have got in and soaked the paper, if it was there, into illegibility. But the leather of the pocket-book seemed to have resisted well. It might easily prove to contain a legible document. He got up in an excitement which his father did not understand. Are you wise to do that, do you think?" he asked in a quick, anxious voice. "There may be something there which will pain you."
"All his papers must be gone through," said his father. "Have you any reason, Colin?"
"I can't explain," said Colin. Papers were coming out of the pocket-book now, in no way perished by the long immersion. They were damp, but they held together, and Colin glanced with a lynx's eye at them as his father unfolded them. There were a couple of bills, he could see, which Philip laid on one side. Then he came to a half-sheet of foolscap. He read a line or two, looked at the bottom of it, and saw his own name.
"What is this?" he said. "It's signed by Raymond and witnessed by you and me."
"Don't look at it, father," said Colin, knowing that it was inevitable that his father must read anything that was witnessed by himself.
"Let me take it and burn it." "No, I can't do that," said Philip. "What does this mean? What—"
"Don't read it. Don't read it," said Colin in a voice of piteous pleading.
"I must."
"Then listen to me instead. I will tell you." Never had his father looked so old and haggard as then. He had seen enough of what was written there to light horror in his eyes and blanch his face to a deadly whiteness.
"Tell me, then," he said.
Colin sat down on the edge of his father's chair. "It's a terrible story," he said, "and I hoped you should never know it. But it seems inevitable. And remember, father, as I tell you, that Raymond is dead." His voice failed for a moment. "That means forgiveness, doesn't it?" he said. "Death is forgiveness. You see what I mean? It's you who have to teach me that. You will see." He collected himself again. "It was after I came back from Capri in the summer, and after Vi was engaged to me," he said, "that what is referred to there took place. He, poor Raymond, always hated me. He thought I had your love, which should have been his as well. Then I had Violet's love, after she had accepted him for her husband. There was a thought in that which made it so bitter that it poisoned him. He got poisoned. You must think of it like that. And the thought, Raymond's poison thought, was this. He knew that Violet had the passion for Stanier which you and I have. Yet when she was face to face with the marriage to him, she gave up Stanier. Father dear, it wasn't my fault that I loved her. You didn't think it was when I told you about in Capri. And it wasn't her fault when she fell in love with me."
"No, Colin," he said. "Love is like that. Go on, my dear."
Colin spoke with difficulty now. "Then came a day," he said, "when a lunatic escaped from that asylum at Repstow. You had news of it one night and told Raymond and me. He was a homicidal fellow, and he got hold of one of your keeper's guns. Next morning, Raymond went to shoot pigeons, and I bicycled on my motor to play golf. And then, Father, we must suppose that the devil himself came to Raymond. It wasn't Raymond who planned what Raymond did. He expected me to come back along the road from the lodge, and he hid in the bushes at that sharp corner, with his gun resting on the wall, and his plan was to shoot me. It would have been at the distance of a few yards only." Lord Yardley interrupted. His voice was hoarse and nearly inaudible.
"Wait a minute, Colin," he said. "All this reminds me of something I have heard, and yet only half heard."
Colin nodded. "I know," he said. "I'll tell that presently. There was poor Raymond waiting for me to come round the corner. There was this madman loose in the park somewhere, and if the plan had succeeded, it would have been supposed that it was the madman who had killed me. But an accident happened. My bicycle punctured, and I walked back for the trudge along the ridge of the old park." Colin choked for a moment. I caught the glint of sun on a gun barrel by the wall at that sharp corner," he said, "and I wondered who or what that could be. It could not be the escaped madman, for they had told me at the lodge that he had been caught. And then I remembered that Raymond was out shooting pigeons, and I remembered that Raymond hated me. It occurred to me definitely then, and I felt sick at the thought that he was waiting for me. And then, Father, the mere instinct of self-preservation awoke. If it was Raymond, if I was terribly right, I could not go on like that in constant fear of my life. I had to make myself safe. I stole down, taking cover behind the oaks, till I got close, and then I saw it was Raymond. I was white with rage, and I was sick at heart. I had a revolver with me for you, or Vi. You, I think, had persuaded me to take it out in case I met the wretched madman. And, Father, I had met a wretched madman. I covered him with it, and then I spoke to him. I told him that if he moved except as I ordered him, I would kill him. He collapsed. Every atom of fight was out of him, and he emptied his gun of its cartridges and laid it down. And all the time there wasn't a cartridge at all in my revolver. I had taken them out and forgotten to put them back. It was after he had collapsed that I found that out." A wan smile, as unlike to Colin's genial heat of mirth as the moonlight is to the noonday sun, shivered and trembled on his mouth and vanished again, leaving it so serious, so tender. "He confessed," he said, "but I had to make myself safe. I told him that he must put that confession into writing and sign it, and you and I would witness it. That was done. I told you, do you remember, that Raymond and I had a secret pact, and we wanted your witness to his signature. That was it, and it is that you hold in your hand now. I sent it to my bank, Bertram's, again as self-defence, for I knew that he would not dare to make any attempt on me, since if it were successful, however far from suspicion he seemed to stand, there would come into your hands the confession that he had attempted to kill me. Look at the envelope, Father. In case of my death, you will read there, it was to be delivered to you." Philip did not need to look. "Go on, Colin," he said. "How did it come into Raymond's possession?" "I can only conjecture that. But this morning, after poor Ray had gone out to skate, I wanted a light for my cigarette, and I had no matches. I drew out something from the waste-paper basket. It was an envelope directed to Raymond, and on the back was the seal of the bank. His handwriting, as you know, was exactly like mine. A spider scrawl, you used to call it. I think he must have written to the bank in my name, asking that what I had deposited there was to be sent to him. He would never be safe till he had got that. And oh, Father, I should never have been safe when he had got it." There was a long silence. Colin's head was bent on his father's shoulder. He lay there quivering, while in Philip's face the grimness grew. Presently Colin spoke again. "You said you had heard, or half heard, some of this," he said. "I will remind you. One night at dinner, the night Ray got back from Cambridge, I made the usual nonsensical fool of myself. I seemed to try to recollect something funny that had happened on the morning when Ray went out to shoot pigeons. "A man with a gun," I said, "and you and Vi voted that I was a bore." But I think Raymond knew why I said it and went on with it till you were all sick and tired of me. I made a joke of it, you see. I could not talk of it to him. Could not be heavy and say, "I forgive you, I wipe it out." That would have been horrible for him. The only plan I could think of was to make a joke of it, hoping that he would understand. I think he did. I think he saw what I meant. And yet he wanted to be safe. Oh, Lord, how I understand that. How anxious I was to be safe and not to have to tell you. But I have had to. If you had listened to me, Father, you would have burned that paper. Then no one would ever have known. Of course, Colin remembered that Violet knew, but he went on without a pause. I'm all to pieces tonight," he said. "I have horrible fears and all sorts of dreadful things occur to me. That paper is safe nowhere, Father. It wasn't even safe, poor Ray, at my bank. Supposing Vi, by some appalling mischance, got to see it. It would poison Raymond's memory for her. He did love her, I am sure of that. And although she didn't love him, she thinks tenderly and compassionately of him. She is not safe while it exists. Burn it, Father. Just look at it once first, if you want to know that I have spoken quiet, sober truth, which I did not want to speak, as you know. And then burn it." Philip's first instinct was to throw it straight into the smouldering logs. He believed every word Colin had said, but there was justice to be done to one who could not plead for himself. He was bound to see that Raymond had acted the story that Colin had told him. Dry-eyed and grim, he read it from first word to last, and then stood up. "Here it is," he said. "You have been scrupulously accurate. I should like you to see me burn it." The paper was damp, and for a little while it steamed above the logs. Then with a flap, a flame broke from it. Little black ash hung to the embers and grew red. Then a faint grey ash ascended and pirouetted. Philip's stern eyes melted, and he turned to his only son. "And now I have got to forget," he said. That seemed the very word Colin was waiting for. "That's easy," he said. "It's easy for me, dear father, so it can't be difficult, for I am an awful brute. We shall have to make a pact, you and I. We must burn what we know out of our hearts, just as you have burned the evidence of it. It doesn't exist any more. It was some wretched dream." "Oh, Colin," said his father. And in those words was all the wonder of love which cannot credit the beauty, the splendour that it contemplates. Colin saw his father to his room, and then walked back down the great corridor, quenching the lights as he went, for he had told the butler that no one need sit up. He drew back the curtains of the window at the head of the stairs as he passed, and looked out onto the clearness of the frosty midnight. Moonlight lay over the whiteness of the gardens and terraces, but the yew hedge, black and unfrosted, seemed like some funeral route to be followed, to where the ice gleamed with a strange vividness, as if it were the skylight to some illuminated place below. Then, letting the curtain fall again, he went softly past the head of the lit passage where his room and Violet's lay, to put out the light at the far end of this corridor. In the last room to the left he knew Raymond was lying, and he went in. The last toilet had been finished, and the body lay on its bed below a sheet. Candles were burning, as if that which lay there dreaded the darkness, and on the table by the bed was a great bowl of white hothouse flowers. Colin had not seen Raymond since that white face looked at him across the rim of broken ice. There had been disfigurement, he imagined, and full of curiosity, he turned back the sheet. There were little scars on the nose and ears particularly, but nothing appalling, and he looked long at Raymond's face. The heavy eyelids were closed, the mouth pouted sullenly. Death had not changed him at all. He hardly looked asleep, drowsy at the most. Not a ray of pity softened Colin's smiling face of triumph. For a month after Raymond's death, the four of them, representing 3 generations of Stanniers, remained quietly there. His name was mentioned less and less among them, for, after Colin's disclosure to his father, Philip avoided all speech about him, and as far as he could, all thought. Horror came with the thought of him. The most his father could do was to try to forget him. But for an accident in that matter of a punctured tyre, Colin would now be lying where Raymond lay, and all sunshine would have passed on his declining years. He was no more than 66, but he was old. Colin used to wonder at the swift advance of old age, like some evening shadow which lengthened so rapidly. But beyond the shadow, Philip's sky was full of light. His desire had been realized, though by tragic ways, and his death, neither dreaded nor wished for, would realize it. There were, however, events in the future which he anticipated with eagerness. The first was Colin's coming of age next March. For generations that festival had been one of high prestige in the family, and in spite of the recency of Raymond's death, he meant to celebrate it with due splendour. The other was even more intimately longed for. Early in July, Violet would, if all were well, become a mother, and to see Colin's son, to know that the succession would continue, was the dearest hope of his life. And these 2 expectations brought back some St. Martin's summer of the spirit to him. He began to look forward, as is the way of youth, instead of dwelling in the past. The lengthening shadow stayed. It even retreated. But Colin had an important piece of business to effect before his father's death, and he was waiting, without impatience, but watchfully, for an opportunity to set out on it. As usual, he wanted the suggestion which would give him this opportunity to come not from himself, but from others. He would seem then to do what he desired, because it was urged on him. A week of dark, foggy weather towards the end of February favoured his plans. Influenza was about, and he had a touch of it. In no way serious, indeed possibly useful. After a couple of days in his room he reappeared again, but with all the fire gone out of him. He was silent and depressed, and saw that his father's eyes watched him with anxiety. "Still feeling rather down?" asked Philip one morning, when Colin pushed an untasted plate away from him at breakfast. Colin made a tragic face at the window. Nothing could be seen outside. The fog was opaque and impenetrable. "That's not very encouraging, Father," he said. "Not convalescing weather." He appeared to pull himself together. But there's nothing to worry about," he said. "I should feel depressed in this damp darkness whether I'd had the flu or not." "You want the sun," said Philip. "Ah, the sun. Is there one? Do show it me." And Philip walked to the window. Thin rain was leaking through the fog. Certainly was not inspiriting. "Well, why not go and see it for yourself?" he said. "There's sun somewhere. Go off to the Riviera for a fortnight with Violet." "Oh, that would be divine if only we could," said Colin. "But I dare say it's funny of me. I don't want Vi to go through the sort of journey you have at this time of years. The trains are crammed. A fellow I know had to stand all the way from Paris to Marseille. I shouldn't like her to do that. Besides, we can't both leave you." "Go alone, then. Violet will understand." Colin sighed. I
I don't think I feel much like travelling either, he said. I'll stick it out, Father. I can go to bed again. I think that's the most comfortable place. Besides, the Riviera is like a monkey house just now.
Go to the villa at Capri, then.
Don't talk of it, said Colin, getting up. Can't I see the stone pine frying in the sunshine? And the freesias will be out, and the wallflowers. Nino, your old boatman's son, wrote to me the other day. He said the spring had come and the vines were budding, and it was already hot. Hot! I could have cried for envy. Don't let's talk of it.
But I will talk of it, said Philip. I'm master here yet.
Father, I don't like that joke, said Colin.
Very well. We'll leave it out and be serious. I shall talk to Violet too.
No, said Colin without conviction. Hello. Here is Vi. Please don't mention the name of that beloved island again, or I shall cry. Morning, Vi. You're enough sunshine for anyone.
Colin strolled out of the room so as to leave the others together, and presently Philip passed through the long gallery and was certainly engaged in telephoning for a while. It was a trunk call, apparently, for there was an interval between the ringing up and the subsequent conversation. All that day, neither Philip nor Violet made the least allusion to Capri, but there was certainly something in the air. The last post that night, arriving while they were at cards, brought a packet for Lord Yardley, which he opened.
There, that's the way to treat obstinate fellows like you, Colin, he observed, and tossed over to him the book of tickets to Naples and back. Father and Violet, you're brutes, he said. I give up. Colin was ever so easily persuaded by Mr. Cecil to spend a couple of nights, if not more, in Naples before he went across to the island, and he had a youthful, pathetic tale to tell. They had had a terrible time in England. No doubt Mr. Cecil had seen the notice of his brother's death. Mr. Cecil could imagine his father's grief, and indeed his own and Violet's. Kind messages, by the way, from them both. They would none of them forgive him if he came to England this year and did not reserve at least a week for them either in London or at Stanier. Then Colin himself had caught influenza, and his father and wife had insisted on his going south for a week or two, and letting the sun soak into him. But after that month of secluded mourning at Stanier, it was rather heavenly. Colin looked like a seraph who had strayed into a sad world as he said this, to pass a couple of days in some sort of city where there were many people and all gay, some stir of life and distraction from his own sorrowful thoughts. One has to buck up again sometime, said Colin, and often I long to escape from Stanier and just go up to town and dine with some jolly people, and go to a music hall and have supper somewhere, and forget it all for a time. Shocking of me, I suppose.
Oh, I understand. I quite comprehend that, Colin, said Cecil. I beg your pardon. I should say Lord Stanier.
Oh, don't, said Colin. I hate the title. It was dear Raymond's. You never saw him, I think. Mr. Cecil had begun to feel like a family friend. He felt himself a sort of uncle to this brilliant boy, so shadowed by woe, so eager to escape out of the shadow. It was his mission, clearly, to aid in this cure, physical and mental, of sunlight.
Never, said he. Only you and your wife and your father. A privilege.
Colin drank the hospitable cocktail that stood at his elbow. His definite plans were yet in the making, but he began to suspect that alcohol in various forms would be connected with them. He had the Stanier head as regards drink. It only seemed to collect and clarify his wits, and he remembered that Mr. Cecil, on that night which he had spent alone here, had quickly passed through joviality, and perhaps want of dignity, to bland somnolence. He got up with an air of briskness and mutual understanding. "I'm not going to be a wet blanket, Mr. Cecil," he said. "I've told you enough to make you see that I pine for enjoyment again. That little restaurant where you and I went before, may we dine there again? I want to see other people enjoying themselves, and I want the sun. Those are my medicines. Be a kind, good doctor to me."
Mr. Cecil's treatment, so he congratulated himself, seemed wonderfully efficacious that evening. Colin cast all sad thoughts behind him, and between one thing and another, and especially between one drink and another, it was after 12 o'clock before they returned from their dinner to Mr. Cecil's flat again. Even then the story was but half told, and Mr. Cecil drew his keys from his pocket to unlock a very private drawer where there were photographs about which he now felt sure Colin would be sympathetic. "You like them?" he giggled as he produced these prints. "Help yourself, Colin. I see they put out some whisky for us." "Oh, Lord, how funny," said Colin, looking at what Mr. Cecil showed him. "But I can't drink unless you do. Say when, Mr. Cecil." Mr. Cecil was looking at the next photograph, and Colin took advantage of his preoccupation. The big bunch of keys by which this very private, drawer was opened still dangled from the lock. "And this one?" said Mr. Cecil, applying himself to the liberal dose. "But what a glorious creature," said Colin. "May I help myself?" Mr. Cecil had a confused idea that Colin had finished his first drink and wanted another. So he finished his own and wanted another. "Of course, my dear boy," he said. "Just a nightcap, eh? A drop of whisky at bedtime, I've noticed, makes one sleep all the sound." Colin was on the apex of watchfulness. Photograph after photograph was handed to him, but long before they came to the end of them, the effects of the nightcap were apparent to Mr. Cecil. The keys still hung from the lock, and Colin, as he replaced the last of this unblushing series, got up and stood between this table drawer and his host. "And that statuette there," he said, pointing to the other side of the room. "Surely we've seen a photograph of that." Mr. Cecil chuckled again, but the chuckle could hardly emerge from his sleep-slack mouth. "I will tell you about that tomorrow," he said, looking around at it. Colin, with one of his caressing, boyish movements, put his hand on Mr. Cecil's shoulder and ever so imperceptibly drew him towards the door. "I feel a different fellow altogether," he said. "I shall sleep like a top, and I have enjoyed myself. You ought to give up your consular work, start a cure for depressed young men. You'd make a fortune." They were out in the passage by this time, and it was clear that the nightcap had banished all thought of his keys from Mr. Cecil's head. He saw Colin to his room, lingered a moment to see that he had all he wanted, and then went to his own. "Charming young fellow," he thought, performed a somnambulistic feat of undressing, and fell into his bed. Colin heard his door shut, and then in a moment turned off his light, and stealthily opening his own door, stood in the entry listening for any sound. For a minute or two there were faint muffled noises from his host's room, but soon all was still, except for the creaking of his own shirt-front as he breathed. Then re-entering his room, he stripped, put on his pyjamas and soft felt slippers which would be noiseless on the boards outside. Once more he stood there and waited, and now from inside Mr. Cecil's room came sounds rhythmical and reassuring. Enough light dribbled in through the uncurtained windows to guide his steps without fear of collision, and he glided into the room they had just left, and felt his way to the table where the keys still dangled. He unloosed them, grasping them in the flap of his jacket so that they should not jingle as he moved, and went down the passage to the door of the consular offices. The big key for the door was in the lock, and turned noiselessly. The archive room lay to the right, and with the door into the house shut behind him, he permitted himself the illumination of a match, and passed through. The shutters were closed, and he lit a candle which stood on the table for official sealing. There in the wall was the locked press that he so well remembered. The trial of half a dozen of the keys on the bunch he carried gave him the one he looked for. The date labels were on the back of the volumes, and he drew out that which comprised the year he wanted. Quietly he turned over the leaves and found the page which contained the contract between Rosina VIII and Philip Lord Stanier. Even in this one candle power light, the erasure was visible to the eye that looked for it. A paper knife lay among the tools of writing on the table, and folding the leaf back to its innermost margin, he severed it from the book and thrust it inside the cord of his trousers. Bright-eyed, and breathing quickly with excitement and success, he replaced the volume and locked the press. He grasped the keys as before, blew out the candle, quenching the smouldering wick in his fingers, and went back, locking the door of the office behind him, into the room from which he had fetched the keys. He replaced them in the drawer of unblushing photographs, and paused for a moment at his own door, listened for the noise that had reassured him before. There it was, resonant and rhythmical. He closed his door, turned up his light, and drew the severed page from his trousers. He had been gone, so his watch told him, not more than 5 minutes. Rosina VIII to Philip Lord Stanier. March 1st, or March 31st, mattered no more. I have but cancelled a forgery, he thought to himself as he pored over it. It was a pity to be obliged to destroy so ingenious a work, which at one time gave him the mastership of Stanier. But Raymond's death had given it him more completely, and it no longer served his end, but was only a danger. Yet should he destroy it, or... His mind went back to the night that he and Violet had passed together here. How supreme had been his wisdom over that! For supposing on his father's death that Violet threatened to contest his succession on the information he had given her to induce her for certain to marry him, what now were there to show but an excised leaf? In whose interest had it been to remove that, except Violet's? For with its disappearance there vanished, as far as she knew, all record of the marriage. Had she had an opportunity of doing so? Certainly, for had she not spent a night here on the return from their honeymoon? Should she be so unwise as to send her lawyer here to examine the register on the ground that had been tampered with, she would be faced with a tampering of an unexpected kind. The leaf had gone. But how lucky that before its suspicious disappearance, Colin had copied out the entry of the marriage and had it certified as correct by the consul himself. He had it safe, with its date, March 1. That would be a surprise to poor Violet when she knew it, and the finger of suspicion wavering hitherto would surely point in one very definite direction. As for the letter from Rosina to Salvatore Viaggi, of which she would profess knowledge on Colin's authority, what did she mean? And where was the letter? Uncle Salvatore, whom Colin would see tomorrow, would be found to know nothing about it. About the destruction of this page. Colin fingered his own smooth throat as he considered that. Supposing Violet seriously and obstinately threatened to contest the succession. And what if, when the page was found to be missing, it was discovered in some locked and secret receptacle of her own? That would be devilishly funny. Colin hoped, he thought, that it would not come to that. He liked Violet, but she must be good. She must be wise. The click of an electric switch and the noise of a step outside sent his heart thumping in his throat. The next moment he had thrust the page into his dispatch box and turned the key on it. The step passed his room and was no longer audible, and with infinite precaution he turned the handle, and holding the door just ajar, he listened. It had not gone the whole length of the passage down to the entry to the consular offices, and even while he stood there he heard the chink of keys. And the step was audible again, and the chink accompanied it. That comprehension came to him, confirmed next moment by the repeated click of the electric switch and the soft closing of his host's door. My luck holds, thought Colin, and blessed the powers that so wonderfully protected him. In another minute he was in bed, but even as sleep rose softly about him, he He woke himself with a laugh. "That's where I'll put the leaf from the register," he thought. "Priceless. Absolutely priceless." It was no news to him when at breakfast next morning Mr. Cecil certified the accuracy of his interpretation of the step.
"Amazingly careless I was last night," he said. "I went straight to bed after we looked at those photographs, and fell asleep at once."
"Nightcap," said Colin. "I did exactly the same."
"Well, my nightcap fell off," said Mr. Cecil. "It fell off with a bang. I hadn't been to sleep more than a quarter of an hour when I woke with a start."
"Some noise?" asked Colin carelessly.
"No, hadn't heard anything, but my conscience awoke me and I remembered I had left my keys in the lock of that private drawer of mine. I got out of bed in a fine hurry, for not only was that drawer unlocked, that would never do, but on the bunch were keys of cupboards and locked cases in the consulate. But there the keys were, just where I'd left them. I can't think how I came to forget them when I went to bed."
Colin looked up with an irresistible gaiety of eye and mouth. "I know," he said. "You were so busy looking after your patient. And you gave me a lot of medicine, Dr. Cecil. Wine, liqueurs, cocktails, whiskies and sodas. I was as sleepy as an owl when I tumbled into bed. How thirsty it makes one in the morning to be sleepy at night." Mr. Cecil broke into a chuckle of laughter.
"Precisely my experience," he said. "Odd. Now can you amuse yourself today until I'm free again?"
"Not so much as if you were with me," said Colin, "but I must pay a duty call to my uncle. I don't say it will be amusing. Do you know him? Salvatore Viaggi?" Mr. Cecil had not that happiness, and presently Colin went in search of the mansion which Salvatore had once alluded to as the Palazzo Viaggi. Leaving nothing to chance that could be covered by design, he had telegraphed from Rome yesterday to say he would make this visit, and wanted a private interview with Salvatore. The Palazzo Viaggi proved to be a rather shabby flat in an inconspicuous street. Salvatore skipped from his chair with open arms to receive him, and assumed an expression that was suitable to the late family bereavement and his joy at seeing Colin.
"Colino mio!" he cried. "What a happy morning is this for your uncle! Yet what a terrible blow has fallen on us since last I saw you! Dear friend, dear nephew, my heart bled for you when I saw the news. So young, and with such brilliant prospects, lamentable indeed. Enough." He squeezed Colin's hand and turned away for a moment to hide his emotion at the death of one whom he had never set eyes. He wore an enormous black tie in token of his grief, but otherwise was as troubadourial as ever. "But we must put away sad thoughts," he continued. "I am all on tenterhooks to know what brings you to my humble doors. Not further bad news? No, not that. Your beloved father is well, I hope. Your beloved wife also, and your revered grandmother? Yes? Put me out of my suspense." The health of these was not so much an anxiety at this moment to Salvatore as the desire to know that all was well with the very pleasant financial assistance which Colin provided. It was easy, in fact, to guess the real nature of his suspense, and consequently Colin found a delicate pleasure in prolonging it a little. "Yes, they're all well," he said. "My father bore the blow wonderfully, considering how devoted he was to Raymond. Violet, too, and my grandmother. You can make your affectionate heart at ease about them all." Thank God, said Salvatore. I got your telegram. I have made arrangements so that our privacy shall be uninterrupted. I have in fact sent Vittoria and Cecilia to visit friends at Posilippo. Such reproaches, such entreaties when they heard their cousin Colin was expected, but I was adamant. "And how are Vittoria and Cecilia?" asked Colin. The troubadour was almost dancing with impatience. "They are well, I am glad to say. They have the constitution of ostriches, or whatever is healthiest in the animal kingdom. But time presses, no doubt, with you, dear fellow. You will be in a hurry. Duties and pleasure no doubt claim you?
No, no, said Colin. I am quite at leisure for the day. I am staying with Mr. Cecil, our consul. He is officially engaged all day, and all the hours are at our disposal. So at last I see the home of my mother's family. Was it here she lived, Uncle Salvatore?
No, in quite another street. My wretched penury drove me here. Even with your bounty, dear Colin, I can scarcely make the two ends meet.
Colin looked very grave.
Indeed, I am very sorry to hear that, he said. Ah, you have come to me with bad news, exclaimed Salvatore, unable to check himself any more. Break it to me quickly, Vittoria.
At last Colin had pity. Let us come to business, Uncle Salvatore, he said. There is no bad news. At least, if there is, you will be making it for yourself. Now, do you remember 2 letters of my mother which you once sent me? We had a talk about them, and I want you to give me your account of them. Can you describe them to me? Salvatore made a tragic gesture and covered his eyes with his hand. The ludicrous creature made a farce of all he touched.
They are graven on my heart, he said. Deep and bitterly are they graven there. The first that I received, dated on the 17th of March, told me of the birth of her twins, one named Raymond, and yourself. The second, dated March the 31st, announced her marriage, which had taken place that day with your father, and he ground his teeth slightly.
Colin leaned forward to him. Uncle Salvatore, you are a marvellous actor, he said. Why did you never go on the stage? I can tell you why. You have no memory at all. Salvatore gave him a hunted kind of look. Was not his very existence, and that of Vittoria and Cecilia, dependent on the accuracy of this recollection? Was Colin putting him to some sort of test to see if he would stick to his impression of those letters?
Dear fellow, those letters and those dates are engraved, as I have previously assured you, on my heart. Alas, that it should be so.
A sudden light dawned on him.
You have come to tell me that I am wrong, he said. Is it indeed true that my memory is at a fault?
Absolutely with regard to the date of one of those letters, said Colin. The date on that which announced my mother's marriage was surely March the 1st, Uncle Salvatore. You are right about the date of the other. Colin suddenly broke into a shout of laughter. His uncle's puckered brow and his effort to recollect what he knew and what he had been told were marvellous to behold. Presently he recovered himself. Seriously, Uncle Salvatore, he said, I want you to see if you cannot recollect that the marriage letter was dated March the 1st. It is very important that you should do that. It will be disastrous for you if you don't. I just want you to recollect clearly that I am right about it. The letters will never be produced, for I have destroyed them both. But surely when you sent me them you thought that it was as I say. Probably you will never be called upon to swear to your belief, but just possibly you may. It would be nice if you could recollect that, to remove the stain from the honour of your illustrious house, and also, parenthetically, from my poor shield. Colin paused a moment, with legs crossed in an attitude of lazy ease. He lay back in his low chair and scratched one ankle with the heel of his shoe. Mosquitoes already, he said. What troublesome things there are in the world. Mosquitoes, you know, Uncle Salvatore. Or want of money, for instance. If I were a scheming, inventive fellow, I should try to arrange to give a pleasant annuity to mosquitoes on the condition of their not biting me. If one bit me after that, I should withdraw my annuity. What nonsense I am talking. It is getting into the sun and the warmth and your delightful society that makes me foolish and cheerful. Let us get back to what I was saying. I am sure you thought that when you gave me those dear letters that the date of your adored sister's marriage was the 1st of March. In all seriousness, I advise you to remember that it was so. That's all. I believe we understand each other. Vittoria's future, you know, and all the rest of it. And on my father's death, I shall be a very rich man. But memory, what a priceless possession is that! If only you had a good memory, Uncle Salvatore. Persuade me that you have a good memory. Reinstate, as far as you can, the unblemished honour of the Viagis. Yes, that's all. Colin got up and examined the odious objects that hung on the walls. There was a picture framed in shells. There was a piece of needlework framed in seaweed. There was a chromolithograph of something sacred. All was shabby and awful. A stench of vegetables and the miscellany called frutta di mare stole in through the windows from the barrows outside the splendid Palazzo Viaggi. "But at the record at the consulate," said Salvatore with Italian cautiousness, "you told me that though the date there appeared to be the same as that which I certainly seem to recollect on the letter—" Colin snapped himself round from an absent inspection of, no doubt, Vittoria's needlework. "But what the deuce has that got to do with you, Uncle Salvatore?" he said. "I want your recollection of the dates on the letters which we have been speaking of, and of nothing else at all. Do I not see Vittoria's handiwork in this beautiful frame of shells? How lucky she has a set of clever fingers, if her father has a bad memory. She will have herself to support, and him as well, will she not? And what do you know of any register at the consulate? The noble Viaggis will not mix themselves up with low folk like poor Mr. Cecil. In fact, he told me that he had not the honour of your acquaintance. Do not give it him. Why should you know Mr. Cecil? About that letter now?" "It was certainly my impression," began Salvatore. Colin interrupted. "I don't deal with your impressions," he said. "Was not the letter concerning my mother's marriage dated the 1st of March? That's all? Yes or no?" Salvatore became the complete troubadour again, and his malachite studs made him forget his black tie. Again he skipped from his chair with open arms. "I swear to it," he said, "the restoration of my adored idol. It has been a nightmare to me to think. It was just that, a bad dream. Were not those letters imprinted on my heart?" Colin evaded his embrace. It was like some monstrous goat in broadcloth. "That's all settled, then," he said. "You were only teasing me when you pretended not to remember. You will be sure not to forget again, won't you? Forgetfulness is such a natural failing. But what dreadful consequences may come of it? Let the thought of them be your nightmare in the future, Uncle Salvatore. There will be pleasant realities instead, if you will only remember, and a pleasant reality is nicer than a bad dream which comes true. I shall be going now, I think." "I cannot permit it," exclaimed Salvatore. "Some wine, some biscuits." "Neither, thanks," said Colin. "I had wine last night, though I can't remember the biscuits. Probably there were some. Vittoria and Cecilia, what an anxiety removed with regard to their future." "And your movements, dear Colino?" exclaimed Salvatore. "You go to Capri?" Colin thought of the tawdry, bibulous evening that probably awaited him, and his uncle's question put a new idea into his head. His innate love of wickedness made it desirable to him to hurt those who were fond of him, if their affection could bring him no advantage. Uncle Salvatore, at any rate, could do nothing more for him, and he was not sure that Mr. Cecil could. Mr. Cecil had been a wonderful host last night. He had fulfilled the utmost requirements of his guest in getting sleepy and drunk. Was there any more use for Mr. Cecil? Drink and photographs and leerings at the attractive maidens of Naples was a very stupid sort of indulgence. "Yes, tomorrow," he said. "Perhaps even by the afternoon boat today." "But alone?" said Salvatore. "How gladly I would relieve your solitude. I would bring Vittoria and Cecilia. How charming a family party." Colin felt some flame-like quiver of hatred spread through him. His nerves vibrated with it. It reached to his toes and fingertips. "A delightful suggestion," he said. "For you and Vittoria, and whatever the other one's name is. But I don't want any of you, thank you. I haven't seen either of them, but I guess what they're like from you. You're like a mixture of a troubadour and a mountebank, and the man who cracks the whip at the horses in a circus, Uncle Salvatore. You're no good to me any more, but I can be awfully bad for you if you lose your memory again. You know exactly what I want you to remember, and you do remember it. You forgot it because I told you to forget it. Now it has all come back to you, and how nice that is. But if you think I am going to bore myself with you and Vittoria and the other, you make a stupendous error. I'm very kind to you, you know. I'm your benefactor to a considerable extent, so you mustn't think me unkind when I utterly refuse to saddle myself with your company. I butter your bread for you. Be content with that. Goodbye. Love to Vittoria." So that was done, and he strolled back along the seafront towards the consulate. Capri, a little more solid only than a cloud, floated on the horizon, and with that delightful goal so near, it was miserable to picture another tiresome, crapulous evening with the little red bounder. Last night, stupid and wearisome though the hours had been, they had yielded him the prize he sought for, whereas tonight there would be no prize of any sort in view. Those interminable drinks, those stupid photographs. Why waste time and energy in the second-hand sort of debauchery? He had been prepared, when he started from England, to spend with Mr. Cecil as much time as was necessary in order to achieve what was the main object of his expedition. But that was accomplished now. He would be so much happier at the villa, where he was, after all, expected today, than in seeing Mr. Cecil get excited and familiar and photographic and intoxicated. The whispering stone pine, the vine-wreathed pergola, the piazza full of dusk and youth, the steps of belated passengers on the pathway outside the garden made sweeter music than the voice of an inebriated consul with its hints and giggles. Stout, middle-aged people, if there had to be such in the world, should keep quiet and read their books and leave the mysteries and joys of youth to the young. It was there in that cloud that floated on the horizon that he had first realized himself, and the hand that led him, and the scent-haunted darkness, and the whispering of that night wind, that fed his soul with the nourishment that Mr. Cecil's cocktails and photographs were starvingly lacking in. He would feast there tonight. A promise to spend another night at the consulate on his return from Capri made good his desertion today, for in point of fact Mr. Cecil felt considerably off-colour this morning, and rather misdoubted his capacity for carrying off with any semblance of enjoyment a repetition of last night. His reproaches and disappointment were clearly complimentary rather than sincere, and the afternoon boat carried Colin on it. Once he had made that journey with his father, once with Violet. But could a wish have brought either of them to his side, he would no more have breathed it than have thrown himself off the boat. Did not want to be jostled and encumbered by love, or hear its gibberish, and with eager eyes revelling in the sense of being alone with his errand, already marvellously accomplished, he watched the mainland recede, and the island draw nearer through the fading twilight. Lights were springing up along the marina, and presently there was Nino alongside in his boat, ready to ferry him ashore. He, with his joyous paganism, his serene indifference to good or evil, was far closer to what Colin hungered for than either his father or Violet. But closer yet, so Colin realized, was the hatred between himself and his own dead brother. And then presently there was the garden, dusky and fragrant with the odour of wallflowers and freesias, and the whispering of the warm breeze from the sea, and the oblong of light from the open door to welcome him. On the table just within there lay a telegram for him, and with some vivid presentiment of what it contained he opened it. His father had died quite suddenly a few hours ago. The whisper of the pine grew louder, and the breeze, suddenly freshening, swept in at the door thick with garden scents, with greeting, with felicitations. End of section 13. Section 14 of Colin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Colin by E.F. Benson. Book 2, Chapter 11. Just a fortnight later, Colin was lying in one of the window seats of the long gallery at Stanier, reading through some papers which required his signature. They had come by the post which Nino had just given him, for he had brought the boy with him from Capri, with a view to making him his valet. His own, he said, always looked as if he were listening to a reading of the 10 Commandments, and Colin had no use for such a person. Nino, at any rate, would bring cheerfulness and some touch of southern gaiety with his shaving water. Besides, no servant approached the Italian in dexterity and willingness. And now that the pause of death was over, adjustments, businesses, the taking up of life again had to begin, and his lawyer was getting things in shape for his supervision. These particular papers were tedious and hard to follow, and were expressed in that curious legal shibboleth which makes the unprofessional mind to wander. He tried to attend, but the effort was like clinging to some slippery edge of ice. He could get no firm hold of it, and the deep waters kept closing over him. There, below the terrace, lay the lake where he had seen one such incident happen. By that he had come heir to all that this fair, shining spring day showed him. His father's death put him in possession, and now, this morning, wherever he turned his eyes, whether on lake or woodland, or within on picture in carved ceiling, all were his. This stately home, the light and desire of his eye, with all that it meant in wealth and position, had passed again into the hands of Colin Stanier, handed down from generation to generation, ever more prosperous, from his namesake, who had built its enduring walls and founded its splendours. Of his father's death there was but little to tell him, when, coming straight back again from Capri, he had arrived here in the set of a stormy day. Philip had reeled as he crossed the hall one morning, and fallen on the hearthrug in front of the Holbein. For half an hour he had lived, quite unconscious and suffering nothing. Then his breathing had ceased. Until the moment of his stroke, that bursting of some large blood vessel on the brain, he had been quite well and cheerful, rejoicing in the fact that Colin by now had found the sun again, and already longing for his return. Violet had been Colin's informant, and she told him these things with that air of detachment from him which had characterized her intercourse with him since Raymond had come home for that last Christmas vacation. She had watched then with some secret horror dawning in her eyes Colin's incessant torture of his brother. That dismay and darkness which had spread its shadow on her in the month of their honeymoon, when she first really began to know Colin, interrupted for a time by their return home in the high festivals of the autumn, had returned to her then with a fresh infusion of blackness. Never once had she spoken to him about his treatment of Raymond, but he was conscious that she watched and shuddered. It did not seem that her love for him was extinguished. That horror of hers existed side by side with it. She yearned for his love, even while she shrank from his pitilessness. She feared him too, not only for the ruthless iron of him, but for the very charm which had a power over her more potent yet. Then came the weeks after Raymond's death, and Colin thought he saw in her a waning of her fear of him. That, he reflected, was natural. Sometime, so he read her mind, she knew she would be mistress here in her own right. It seemed very reasonable that she should gain confidence. For the last few days, when the wheels of life were now beginning to turn again, he saw with a comprehending sense of entertainment that there was something in Violet's mind. She was trying to bring herself up to a certain point, and it was not hard to guess what that was. She was silent and preoccupied, and a dozen times a day she seemed on the verge of speaking that which he knew was the subject of her thought. Till today, her father and mother and Aunt Hester, in becoming mourning, had been with them. Now they had gone, and Violet's restlessness had become quite ludicrous. She had been in and out of the room 6 times. She had sat down to read the paper, and next moment it had dropped from her lap, and she was staring at the fire again, lost in frowning thought. Knowing what her communication when it came must be, Colin, from the very nature of the case, could not help her out with it, that he wished that she would wrestle with and vanquish her hesitation. If it had been he who in this present juncture had had to speak to Raymond on this identical subject, how blithely would he have undertaken it. Then finally, Violet seemed to make up her mind to take the plunge, and sat down on the edge of the seat where he lounged. He extended his arm and put it round her. "Well, Vi," he said, "are you finding it hard to settle down?" "I am too, but we've got to do it." "My dear, Aunt Hester's little black bonnet. Did you ever see anything so chic? Roguish. She gets sprightlier every day." Violet looked at him gravely. "There is something we have to talk about, Colin," she said, "and we both know what it is. Will you let me speak for a minute or two without interrupting me?" He put his finger on the line to which he had come in this tiresome document, which his solicitor assured him required his immediate attention. "An hour or two, darling. The longer the better," he said. "What is it? Are you sure I know? Something nice, I hope. Ah, is it about my birthday, perhaps? The last affair that dear father was busy over were plans for my birthday. Of course I have counter-ordered everything, and we must keep it next year. Well, what is it? I won't interrupt any more." And Colin leaned back with his hand still under Violet's arm, as if to draw her with him. She bent with him a little way, and then disengaged herself. I hate what lies before me," she said, "and I ask you to believe that I have struggled with myself. I have tried, Colin, to give the whole thing up, to let it be yours. But I can't. I long to be Lady Yardley in my own right, as you told me I should be on Uncle Philip's death. All that it means. I fancy you understand that. But I think I might have given that up, if it was only myself of whom I had to think. I don't know. I can't be sure." She paused, not looking at him. She did not want to know until all was done how he was taking it. Of course he anticipated it. He knew it must be, and here was the plain point of it. "But I haven't got only myself to think about," she said. "Before many months I shall bear you a child. I shall bear you other children after that, perhaps. I am thinking of them, and of you. Since we married I have learned things about you. You are hard in a way that I did not know was possible. You have neither love nor compassion. I must defend my children against you. The only way I can do it is to be supreme myself. I must hold the reins, not you. I will be good to you, and shall never cease loving you, I think. But I can't put myself in your hands, which I should do if I did not now use the knowledge which you yourself conveyed to me. You did that with your eyes open. You asked for and accepted what your position here will be, and you did it chiefly out of hatred to Raymond. That was your motive, and it tells on my decision. You hate more than you love, and I am frightened for my children. It is true that when I accepted Raymond, I did it because I should get Stanier, be mistress here anyhow. But I think I was wavering, that I should have thrown him over before I married him and have accepted you, though I knew that marriage with you forfeited the other. And then you told me it was otherwise, that in forfeiting Stanier, I found it even more completely." Colin, he had promised not to interrupt, gave no sign of any sort. His finger still marked the place in this legal document. "I have sent for my father's solicitor," she said, "and they have told me he is here.
But before I see him, I wanted to tell you that I shall instruct him to contest your succession. I shall tell him about the register at the consulate at Naples, and about your mother's letters to your uncle. You said you would let me have them on your father's death. Would you mind giving me them now, therefore? He may wish to see them."
Colin moved ever so slightly, and she, for the first time, looked at him. There he lay, with those wide, childlike eyes, and the mouth that sometimes seemed to her to have kissed her very soul away. He had a smile for her grave glance. Just so had he smiled when torturingly he tried to remember exactly what had happened in the old park on the day that Raymond shot pigeons. But even while she thought of his relentless pursuing glee, the charm of him, the sweet supple youth of him, all fire and softness, smote on her heart.
"Won't you go away till it's all over?" she said. "It will be horrible for you, Colin, and I don't want you to suffer. The letters are all I want of you. I will tell Mr. Markham about the register, and he will do whatever is necessary. Go back to your beloved island. You were robbed of your stay there. Wait there till all this business, which will be horrible for you, is done. You can see your dear Mr. Cecil again," she added, trying to smile back at him.
"Yes, I might do that," said Colin thoughtfully. "In fact, I probably shall. But I must try to take in what you have been saying. I can't understand it. You must explain. You referred, for instance, to my mother's letters. What letters? I don't know of any letters of my mother as being in existence. Still less have I got any. How could I have? She died when I was but a few weeks old. Do mothers write letters to the babies at their breasts?"
"The 2 letters to your uncle," said she.
Colin planted a levering elbow by his side and sat up. "I suppose it is I who am mad," he said, "because you talk quite quietly and coherently, yet I don't understand a single word of what you say."
"Letters from my mother to my uncle."
"Ah." He took her hand again, amending his plan in accordance with his talk with Salvatore. "You're right," he said. "Uncle Salvatore did once give me 2 letters from my mother to him. Little faint things. I destroyed them not so long ago. One should never keep letters. But you were right, Vi. Uncle Salvatore did give me a couple of letters once. But when on earth did I mention them to you? What a memory you've got. It's quite true. One announced my mother's marriage, and the other spoke of the birth of poor Raymond and me. But what of them? And what... Oh, I must be mad. What in heaven's name do you mean when you talk, if I understand you correctly, about sending somebody out to Naples? The register and the consulate there? And my succession? Are they connected? Isn't it usual for a son to succeed his father? I'm all at sea. Or am I asleep and dreaming? Pinch me, darling, I want to wake up. What register? Some nightmare sense of slipping took hold of Violet.
"The erasure in the register," she said. "All that you told me."
Colin swung his legs off the window seat and got up. There was an electric bell close at hand, and he rang it. "There's some plot," he said, "and I've no idea what it is. I want a witness with regard to anything further that you wish to say to me. What's his name? Your father's solicitor, I mean. Oh, yes, Markham. Don't speak another word to me." He turned his back on her and waited till a servant came in. "Her ladyship wishes to see Mr. Markham," he said. "Ask Mr. Markham to come here at once."
"Colin,"
she began. It was just such a face he turned on her now as he had given to her one evening at Capri. "Not a word," he said. "Hold your tongue, Violet. You'll speak presently." Mr. Markham appeared, precise and florid. Colin shook hands with him. "My wife has a statement to make to you," he said. I don't know what it is. She has not made it yet, but it concerns me and the succession to my father's title and estates. It had therefore better be made to you in my presence. Please tell Mr. Markham what you were about to tell me, Violet." In dead silence, briefly and clearly, Violet repeated what Colin had told her on the night that they were engaged. All the time he looked at her, Mr. Markham would have said, with tenderness and anxiety. And when she had finished, he spoke. "I hope you will go into this matter without delay, Mr. Markham," he said. "My wife, as I have already told her, is perfectly right in saying that my uncle, you will need his address, gave me 2 letters from my mother to him. She is right also about the subject of those letters. She is under a complete delusion about the dates of them. I destroyed them not so long ago, I am afraid, so the only person who can possibly settle this is my uncle, to whom I hope you will apply without delay. No doubt he will have some recollection of them. Indeed, he cherished them for years, and if the dates were as my wife says that I told her they were, he must have known that my brother and I were illegitimate. And so much for the letters." Colin found Violet's eyes fixed on him. Her face, deadly pale, wore the stillness of stone. "With regard to my wife's allegation about the register," he said, "I deny that I ever told her any such story. Now I have this to add. When my father and I were in Naples last summer, I made, at his request, a copy of the record of his marriage from the consular register. He thought, I fancy, that in the event of his death a certified copy of it here in England might be convenient for the purpose of proving the marriage. I made that copy myself, and Mr. Cecil, our consul in Naples, certified it to be correct. I gave it to my lawyer a few days ago when he was down here, and it is of course open to your inspection." Colin paused and let his eyes rest wistfully on Violet. "My wife, of course, Mr. Markham," he said, "is under a delusion, but she's made the allegation, and in justice to me I think you will agree that it must be investigated. She supposes, don't you, darling, that there is an erasure in the register at the consulate showing that it has been tampered with, and that erasure points to an attempt on someone's part, presumably my father's or my own, to legitimatize his children. In answer to that, I am content for the present to say that when I made the copy I saw no such erasure, nor did Mr. Cecil, who certified the correctness of it. Mr. Cecil, to whom I will give you an introduction, will no doubt remember the incident. I am glad I have got that copy, for if the register proves to have been tampered with, it may be valuable. My belief is that no such erasure exists. May I suggest, Mr. Markham, that you or some trustworthy person should start for Naples at once? You will take the affidavits, is it not, of my uncle with regard to the letters, and of Mr. Cecil with regard to the genuineness of the copy of my father's marriage. You will also inspect the register. The matter is of the utmost and immediate importance." He turned to Violet. "Vi, darling," he said, "let us agree not to speak of this again till Mr. Markham has obtained full information about it. Now perhaps you would like to consult him in private? I will leave you." Mr. Markham shared Colin's view as to the urgency and importance of setting this matter at rest, and left for Naples that evening with due introductions to Salvatore and the consul. Colin had a word with him before he left, and with tenderness and infinite delicacy spoke of Violet's condition. Women had these strange delusions, he believed, at such times, and the best way of settling them was to prove that they had no foundation. Mr. Markham, he was afraid, would find that he had made a fruitless journey, as far as the ostensible reason for it went. But he had seen for himself how strongly the delusion had taken hold on his wife, and in that regard he hoped for the best results. In any case, the thing must be settled. Never had the sparkle and sunlight of Colin's nature been so gay as during these 2 days when they waited for the news that Mr. Markham would send from Naples. It had been agreed that the issues of his errand should not be spoken of till they declared themselves, and here, to all appearance, was a young couple, adorably adorned with all the gifts of nature and inheritance, with the expectation of the splendour of half a century's unclouded days spread in front of them. They had lately passed through the dark valley of intimate bereavement, but swiftly they were emerging into the unshadowed light, where, in a few months now, the glory of motherhood, the pride of fatherhood awaited them. 2 days from now, as both knew, a disclosure would reach them which must be, one way or the other, of tremendous import. But for the present, pending that revelation, presage and conjecture, memory even of that interview with Mr. Markham, which had sent him across the breadth of Europe, were banished. They were as children in the last hour of holidays, as lovers between whom must soon a sword be unsheathed. They wandered in the woods, where in the hot early spring the daffodils were punctual, and, coming before the swallow dares, took the winds of March with beauty. And Colin picked her the pale cuckoo pint, which, intoxicated with nonsense, he told her comes before the cuckoo dares. They spoke of the friendship of their childhood, which had so swiftly blossomed into love, and of the blossom of their love that was budding now. All day the enchantment of their home and their companionship waved its wand over them, and at night, tired with play, they slept the light sleep of lovers. Certainly, for one or other of them, there must soon come a savage awakening, or more justly the stranglehold of nightmare. But there were a few hours yet before the dreams of springtime and youth were murdered. The 3rd day after Mr. Markham's departure for Naples was Colin's birthday, when he would come of age. And Violet, waking early that morning, while it was still dark, found herself prey to some crushing load and presage of disaster, most unpropitious, most unbirthday-like. For the last 2 days, these days of waiting for news, they had made for themselves a little artificial oasis of sunshine and laughter. Now some secret instinct told her that she could linger there no more. Today, she felt sure, would come some decisive disclosure, and she dreaded it with a horror too deep for the plummet of imagination. That dark hour before dawn, when the vital forces are at their lowest, she lay hopeless and helpless. Colin had denied all knowledge of what he had himself told her. He had been eager for Mr. Markham to disprove it. He knew something which she did not. What that could be, she could form no idea at all. At the worst, Salvatore would confirm his account of those letters, and no such erasure as Colin had spoken of would be found in the register. Had he then invented this merely to ensure her marrying him? Now that Raymond's death had given him mastership at Stanier, was he simply denying what never existed at all? From what she knew of him now, he was capable of having done that in order to make her throw over Raymond. But it was not that which she dreaded. It was something more. A black curtain seemed to hang before her, and presently some hot blast would blow it high in the air, and she would see what lay behind it. It was rapidly growing light, and outside the birds were busy with their early chirrupings. By the window which last night Colin had opened, pulling back the curtains, the silver of her Paul Lamoureux toilet set glimmered with the increasing brightness. Colin lay close to her, with face turned towards her, fast asleep. His cheek was on his hand. The other arm, languid and slack, was stretched outside the bedclothes. His mouth was a little parted, and it seemed to be smiling. Then he stirred, leaning his head a little back. His smile broadened, and he laughed in his sleep with open mouth. At that, some nameless panic seized her, and stopping her ears, she buried her face in the clothes. A child might laugh so, but was the merriment of his dream that of a child? Or had some sense that did not sleep reminded him that his 21st birthday was now dawning? She feigned to be asleep when Nino's tap came to the door of his dressing-room, and she heard Colin get up. He spoke to her quietly, but she did not answer or open her eyes. Then his room door opened and closed, and she was alone. Colin was already at breakfast when she came down, and apparently his mood of the last 2 days had suffered no ungenial change. "Good morning, darling," he said. "I tried to say that to you before, but you were busy sleeping. What shall I give you? There's some nasty fish and some tepid bacon." He looked at her with some sort of wistful expectancy, as if wondering if she would remember something. And the thoughts, the wild imaginings which had made the dawn a plunge into some dark menace, dropped from her mind like drugged creatures. "Colin, dear, your birthday. What can I give you?" she said, kissing him. "It was the first thing I thought of when I woke. We're the same age again. I was a year ahead of you till this morning." "Delicious of you to remember it, Vi," said he. "Yes, we're 42 years old between us. A great age. Hello, Nino." "Bella signora," said Nino, and gave Violet a telegram. Colin watched her fingers fumbling at the gummed flap of the envelope, as if numb and nerveless. Then, with a jerk, she tore it across and opened it. Only once before had he seen a living face as white as that, when fingers were slipping from the ice.
"Read it for me," she said at length. I don't seem to see what it means."
Colin took it. It had been sent from Naples late last night and came from Mr. Markham. He read: "Salvatore Viaggi's account of letters agrees with your husband's. Page containing marriages of year and month in question has been cut out of register at consulate." Colin passed the sheet back to Violet. She did not take it from his hand, and he let it drop onto the tablecloth. He leaned a little towards her. "Vi, you're magnificent," he said. "That was a glorious stroke of yours. That night when you and I stayed at the consulate. No, darling, don't interrupt. Let me speak for 2 or 3 minutes, just as you did a few mornings ago. Eat your bacon and listen. I see now the reason of your pretended reluctance to stay with Mr. Cecil. It put me off the scent completely at the time."
"What scent?" she asked. "What do you mean?"
"I asked you not to interrupt. There we were on our honeymoon, and so casually, so unthinkingly, I told Mr. Cecil that we would stay with him on our way home. You objected, but eventually you agreed. Your reluctance to stay with him, as I say, put me quite off the scent. Having done that, you yielded. Little did I dream then of your superb project." She gazed at him like some bird hypnotized by the snake that coil after coil draws nearer. Colin, too, drew nearer. He pushed his chair sideways and leaned towards her, elbows on the table. "I remember that night so well," he said. "I was sleeping in the dressing room next door to you, and the door was wide, for it was hot. I heard you get out of bed. I heard your latch creak. Oh, yes, you called to me first, and I did not answer. I called to you this morning, you remember, and you did not answer. Sometimes one pretends to be asleep. Till this minute I knew nothing for certain more of what you did. Now I know. You were playing for a great stake. I applaud you. You got hold of Mr. Cecil's keys, he is careless about them, and tore that leaf out of the register. You knew that on my father's death his marriage to my mother must be proved before Raymond or I, poor Raymond, could succeed, for of course it was common property that he lived with her before they were married. Giuseppe, his boatman, Uncle Salvatore, half a dozen people could have told you that. And then, oh, a crowning piece of genius. You make up a cock and bull story about erasure and letters which force us to have the register examined, and lo, there is no record of the marriage at all. What is the presumption? That Raymond and I were, well, an ugly word, but just their fate was unkind to you through no fault of yours, except that failure is a fault, and the most fatal one. You did not know that I had made a copy of the entry, and got it signed and certified by our charming Mr. Cecil before the curious disappearance of that page. And then you made just one terrible mistake. How could you have done it? She turned to him a face of marble, faultlessly chiselled, but wholly lifeless. "What mistake did I make?" she said. "You kept that leaf," said Colin pityingly. "A record of your triumph, I suppose, like a cotillion toy, to dream over when you were mistress here." "Go on," said she. Colin came closer yet. "Darling, will you be awfully nice to me?" he said. "Give me that leaf as a birthday present. It would be a delightful souvenir. You know where it is." She paused. She remembered the tradition of the icy self-repression of the Lady Yardleys who had preceded her, the frost that fell on them. From personal knowledge there was her grandmother. That Arctic night was darkening on her now, and she shivered. "I don't know where it is," she said. "Make up another lie." He rose. "You must learn politeness, Violet," he said. "You must learn many useful things. I am being very kind to you. You don't appreciate that." Night had not quite fallen yet. "Just as you were kind to Raymond," she said. He smiled at her. "Yes, the same sort of kindness," he said. He spoke to her as to a troublesome child with soft persuasion. "Now, you know where it is quite well, but you want to give me the trouble of reminding you. You won't say you're sorry or anything of that sort. Not wise." "Spring the trap on me," she said. "Very well. You put it in the secret drawer in the stand of your lovely Lamerie looking-glass the evening we came back from our honeymoon. You left me talking to Father, but as soon as you had gone I followed you. It was pure chance. I suspected nothing then, but I looked in from my dressing-room and saw you with the secret drawer open, putting something into it. I went downstairs again, but I am bound to say that my curiosity was aroused. Perhaps you might have been having a billet doux from Nino. So I took a suitable opportunity, I think it was when you were at church, and satisfied myself about it." Colin reviewed this speech, which seemed to come to him impromptu, except for the one fact that underlay it, which in a few minutes now would be made manifest to Violet. "So poor Nino was not my rival," he said. "That was such a relief, Vi, darling, for I should have had to send him away. But I never really gave a serious thought to that, for I believed you liked your poor Colin. What I found did surprise me. I could not believe that anyone so clever could have been so stupid as to keep the evidence of her cleverness. When you have been clever, it is wise to destroy the evidence of your cleverness. Shall we come?" But my looking-glass. The secret drawer?" said Violet. "There's no secret drawer that I know of." No, of course not," said Colin. "I shall be obliged to show it to you. But wait a minute. I'd better have a witness of what I find in the secret drawer of which you are ignorant. My solicitor is here, but with this other disclosure he might urge me to proceed against you for conspiracy, which I don't at present intend to do. Your maid now. No, you would not like her to know such things about you. She might blackmail you. How about Nino? He will do no more than understand that a paper has been found, and that he witnesses to the finding of it. One has to protect oneself. I had to protect myself against Raymond. May I ring for Nino?" At that, the Arctic night fell on Violet, and presently the three of them were in her bedroom. Round the base of the looking-glass ran a repoussé cable-band, and Colin was explaining to her how, if she pressed the stud at the corner of it, just where the silversmith's name, L.A. for Lamerie, was punched in the metal, the side of the base would fly open. And so it was. She pressed it herself while he stood aside, and within was the drawer and the folded paper. Colin took a swift step and plucked the paper out, holding it at arm's length. "There, darling, all your responsibility is over," he said. "I will keep it for you now. I will just open it and show you what it is. Do not come too close or try to snatch it. There. Names of happy couples, one below the other, and in the space next to the name, the date of their marriage. Halfway down the page you see the name we are looking for. Rosina Viaggi and Philip Lord Stanier, and the date, March the 1st, 1893. He turned to Nino and spoke in Italian. "And you, Nino," he said, "you saw me take this paper out of the drawer of the signora's looking-glass, and now you see me, give me a big envelope from the table, you see me put it into this envelope and close it. It is as if I did a conjuring trick, and I sit down and write on the envelope for the signora to read. I say that in your presence and in mine, the enclosed was taken from the secret drawer in the looking-glass, where it had been placed for safe custody by Violet Stanier, Countess of Yardley, and given into the care of her husband, Colin Stanier, Earl of Yardley. And sign it, Nino, and observe that I sign. I date it also. That's all, Nino. You may go." Colin laid his hand on Violet's neck. "It has been trying for you, dear," he said. "Rest a little. But your mind may be at ease now. The anxiety of having that in your possession is removed, and will be in safe keeping. I will give it at once to my lawyer, with instructions that it is to be delivered to no one except to me in person, and that at my death it is to be destroyed unopened. It entirely depends on you as to whether it ever sees the light again. And then, when you are rested, shall we go for one of our delicious rambles in the park? What's that line of Wordsworth? 'This one day will give to idleness.' Thank you, darling, for your lovely birthday present." Never on Walpurgis night, nor at Black Mass, had there ever been so fervent an adorer to his God as Colin, so satanic a rite as that which he had performed on his birthday morning. No need was there for him to make any vow of lip service, or by any acceptation of the parchment that was set in the frame of the Holbein to confirm his allegiance. The spirit was more than the letter, and in no wanton ecstasy of evil could he have made a more sacramental dedication of himself. It was not enough for him to have forged, ever so cunningly, the evidence which, while Raymond lived, proved his illegitimacy, nor, more cunningly yet, to have got rid of that evidence when Raymond's death cleared for him the steps to the throne. He must, in the very flower and felicity of wickedness, preserve that evidence in order to produce it as the handiwork of his wife. The edifice would have been incomplete otherwise, and would have lacked that soaring spire of infamy. But now all was done, and on his birthday came the consecration of the abominable temple of himself to the spirit he adored. He came to her room that night, and sat, as he so often did, on the edge of her bed. "You have been perfect to me today, darling," he said. "You have given me the happiest birthday. You have been so quiet and serene and controlled. And have you been happy?" "Yes, Colin," said she. He pulled off his tie and flapped her fingers with the end of it. "I think I shall go south again," he said. "I was defrauded of my stay in Capri owing to my father's death. What about you? Had you not better quietly stay at home? Get your father and mother to come down?" "Just as you please," said she. "Let us settle it like that, then. And look at me a moment, Violet." She raised her eyes to his. "Ah, that's right," he said. "You've had a lesson today, darling. It has tired you, and I will leave you to sleep in one moment." "We can't have you tired. You must take great care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, be out a great deal. About that lesson. Take it to heart, Vi. Never again try to cross my path. It's much too dangerous. And you've no delusions left about letters and registers, have you?" "Answer me, dear." "No," said she. "That's good. Now I'll leave you." The March night was warm and moonlit, and Colin stood by the open window, letting the breeze stream in against his skin, and looked out over terrace and lake and woodland. All that he had so passionately desired since first he toddled about the stately home of his race was his, and nothing now could upset his rights. And how wonderful the process of arriving at it had been! Every step of that way was memorable. Fraud, intrigue, trickery, matchless cruelty had paved the road, and today the road was finished. He put out his light and curled himself up in bed. Violet's firstborn must surely be a son, who should learn early and well from lips that knew what they were saying the sober truth of that which in the legend wore the habiliment of medieval superstition. He should learn how poor Uncle Raymond had allowed himself to love. Yes, there was a time when he had loved Mother, and was that not tiresome for him? Mother happened to prefer Father. Well, poor Uncle Raymond had loved, and that perhaps was his undoing, for he had fallen into the lake under the ice, and the icy water had smothered him, and the fishes had nibbled him. Colin chuckled to himself at the thought of recounting that. For a moment, as he looked out onto the night, he had experienced a dullness and dimness of spirit as of a cloud passing over the bright circle of the moon, at the thought that he had accomplished all that had so thrillingly occupied him. But at the thought of his fatherhood, the brightness shone forth again. How fascinating it would be to till and to sow in that soft soil, to rear the seedlings that he would water and tend so carefully, to watch them putting forth the buds of poisonous flowers that swelled and prospered till they burst the sheaths of childhood and opened wide-petalled to night and day. His thoughts, drowsy and content, turned towards Violet. Certainly there had been noticeable in her all day a freezing, a congealment. She was becoming like those impassive portraits of her predecessors, marble women out of whose eyes looked some half-hidden horror. A flash of lightning, very remote, blinked in through the uncurtained oblong of the window opposite his bed, and a mutter of thunder as drowsy as himself answered it. He slid his hand underneath his cheek and fell asleep. End of section 14. End of Colin by E. F. Benson.